This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, that being said, hi everyone, I'm very happy to be here today. This is actually the first time I'm going to present this new research of mine. And I think this is the best way to do in a seminar on Israel studies. Basically, it's titled State Management of Unpopular Religious Public Policies in Israel, and this is a comparative outlook of three different policies. You all can see my presentation, by the way?
Yes.
So the theoretical core of this study lays within the democratic theory. Overall, when we're talking about the democratic process, we usually see that when institutional designs, meaning legal institutional arrangements, lose their legitimacy, we face civil dissatisfaction that should be, according to democratic theory, resolved by a change in policy. Nonetheless, there are cases that we witness democratic deficits, which means that still these institutional designs lose their legitimacy, and we do see civil dissatisfaction, yet there is no change in policy by state institutions, and we face enduring gaps between the policy as designed and public will. My question here is why? Why do we see these enduring gaps? And the answer I would like to propose is the management of unpopular policies rather than its realignment. So focusing on the Israeli case, and of course on state religion issues, we should go back to the critical juncture of state establishment just before 1948, and the status quo agreement letter. It has so many interpretations by historians, but basically the letter that David Ben Gurion, as the future head of state, sent to the Agudat Israel in order to construct a unified front to the UN in order to get the state. So he promised religious policies on four main issues, three of which are relevant to the study today, which is the Shabbat, meaning that includes, by the way, public transportation on Shabbat, because the keeping of the Shabbat is only in the public realm. You're not obligated to keep it in your private realm. So we're talking about, in my study on public transport, the keeping of kashrut, eating kosher food in public institutions, and on marriage, which means that in Israel, you can only legally marry in a religious manner. Okay, we do not have civil marriage in Israel, no other framework, legal, official framework to wed in the state. Now, in the over 7 decades since state establishment, we can say that the core of these policies remains intact, with no policy modification. Now, focusing a little bit about the Israeli society in order to understand dissatisfaction with existing policies, these are recent statistics from the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel, where we see that 74% of Israelis are Jewish. When divided into levels of religiosity, we see that roughly 45% are non-religious, meaning secular, 33% are traditional. Mind that this is a very, very complex kind of definition, since traditional means so many things. Some people will drive on the Shabbat and define themselves as traditional, where others will not. Roughly 12% are religious and 10% are ultra-Orthodox. Now, when I'm talking about dissatisfaction with existing policies, so the survey conducted for this study's purposes showed that roughly 58% of Israeli Jews are dissatisfied with the policy, 88% are secular, 51.2% traditional, 16.7% religious, and 0% ultra-Orthodox. Okay, so many times when I talk about dissatisfaction with religious policies, I'm accused of talking only on the secular stream in society, but this is not the case. You can see the traditional and religious communities are also, to some extent, are dissatisfied with the policy. So this was important to me to mention at the beginning of my presentation. So despite that core policies remain intact since state establishment, we see different alternatives in the different policies in Israel. For example, when we're talking about public transportation on the Shabbat, we see civil initiatives that with time also entered the local government realm of public, private, not funded by the state transport on Saturdays, providing this lacking service to citizens. We see many alternatives, many alternatives to the religious marriage in the country, starting with civil marriage abroad, initiating a common law spouses status, civil NGOs, spiritual NGOs that initiate couplehood agreements and ceremonies, and many couples in the country use it. And finally, when talking about kosher food inspection, despite that only the Chief Rabbinate of Israel until very recently was the only legislative body to grant such certificates to public and private businesses, they were private, now they're actually engaging publicly, but we're talking about other Orthodox, not non-Orthodox, only Orthodox stream kind of institutions that also grant kosher food certificates to businesses, and they are allowed to do it recently by the state. So we have the policy as designed that remains intact, we have public dissatisfaction with the policy, and we have different alternatives that are not connected to any kind of legislative modification. So a little bit about theory. Artur also some from political science and some from religious studies incorporated. So when we're talking about governments, institutional barriers, and unpopular policies, going back to the democratic theory, we realize that sometimes the duties of governments, being representative governments, are in sharp contrast with public will. And the reason for that is embedded in institutions. They are mainly constrained by institutions which are the basic rules of the game. We play games by the laws that institutions grant us. Despite that institutions are usually in political science described as the professed as the building block of democracy, sometimes they are indeed not when we're talking about democratic deficits. This really goes against the democratic principle, which I'm basing on Robert Dahl's argument that a key characteristic of a democracy is the continuing responsiveness of the government to the preferences of its citizens, which in democratic deficits does not happen. So why are institutions considered to be constraints that they actually make governments unable to change policy? This has a lot to do with historical institutionalism. It's a stream in the new institutionalism that actually argues that when institutions are formed at critical junctures, such as state establishment, they, with every step they take, we call it path dependent step, in the way they actually engage in self-reinforcing processes that gain in increasing returns. They gain a lot of value, and it is very hard after choosing a path a long time to alter the institutional framework. This is why at the end of the day we face an institutional lock-in. It is very hard to change institutions. And then governments actually operate in a monopolized situation. Now, religion really fits in here because religion is a monopolistic institutional barrier. Usually religion in religious studies takes on, defined as taking on an institutional form that structures the setting of religion. And when referring to the classic twin tolerations of Alfred Stepan, he argues that despite that governments should allow religious freedom, it bans imposing religion on democracy, law, and the religious freedom of others. Most importantly, it bans religion mandating policy. Okay? Then in states, democratic states, of course, that do not separate religion and politics, we can see that religious rules may be incorporated into the official policies, the institutional designs, and also that other agencies, religious agencies and religious courts are also taking a form of an institution, a state institution, meaning that they are incorporated in the democratic framework. So how would it cause dissatisfaction? Religion being a part of the institutional framework in a democracy. This is because the institutional needs really vary, and taking it, borrowing from the economics of religion, you can see that there is no single religion that is likely to satisfy all, and usually religious preferences in society are pluralistic, meaning that even in more homogeneous, culturally formed societies, we might face differences like different levels of religiosity, just as we see in the Israeli case. And that pluralistic religious environments usually eliminate the societal dissatisfaction. At the end of the day, such theories indicate that we can approach religion just like any other institutional barrier. This is a paradigmatic case study to societal dissatisfaction. So in light of this theoretical framework, I pose these research question: which strategies state institutions use to maintain their existing policies, and to what extent are citizens content with these strategies? I hypothesize that the management of these unpopular policies is steered through three distinct strategies, being disregard, accommodation of under the threshold alternatives, and partial institutional modification. These strategies, they intend to keep state-religion relationship intact in the state, yet they require different adjustments from state institutions. And three, that the employment of these strategies usually leaves distinct groups in society displeased to different extents as a direct result of the strategy chosen. To conclude, the democratic deficit is what causing state institutions to employ strategies to manage these policies in a way that is aimed to reduce the civil discontent with the policies. Now, very briefly on the three strategies that I'm talking about. The first being disregard, meaning state institutions do not ban, do not embrace different alternatives that are offered usually by NGOs, society, sometimes local governments. They simply disregard, they do not ban it, at least. Accommodation of under the threshold alternatives, meaning that we have many initiating sources to provide band-aids to this unpopular policy, sometimes civil society, sometimes the judicial system, and the state institutions usually embrace these alternatives, meaning that they grant citizens who use them the same rights and privileges of other citizens that use the legal route to establish this service. Yet this is not a part of the institutional framework, it is under the threshold. And last, the partial institutional modification, meaning that the core of the policy remains intact, yet at the fringes of the policy, we see some modifications taking place, yet leaving the core of the policy intact. The research design for this study is a mixed methods design. It contains three tools: textual analysis of primary and secondary sources, mainly documentation on the policies, the official policies, existing statistics by state institutions, and also research centers, and the core being a public opinion survey, a representative one conducted this January 22 by the Institute of Liberty and Responsibility at Reichman University. It was conducted using cluster sampling in order to represent Israeli Jewish society divided into level of religiosity. So going to the findings. First, I would like to talk about the findings on satisfaction with policy. Existing statistics when talking about public transportation on Saturday in Israel shows that roughly 60% since the 80s until very recently, they want public transportation on Saturdays. We usually ask this question in a very polite way, meaning we will do that, but outside of very religious areas in the country. So you see that 64% in positive replies in 2021. In the current survey, you see that 63% said they completely agree or mostly agree that Israel needs to provide public transportation on Saturdays. Of course, when divided into levels of religiosity, you can see that the ultra-Orthodox, of course, 0% agree with this statement, but still secular, traditional, and religious segments do support it to different extents. When we're talking about marriage policy, asking to allow a second way to marry in Israel, to leave the religious marriage for those of you who want it, but yet offer an official civil marriage in the country, also roughly 60% since the 60s, by the way, argued that there should be a civil way to marry in Israel. In the 2022 survey, roughly 65%.
Sorry, brutally cut in. We are out of time, so if you can go to the results in 2 or 3 minutes, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. So again, 65% in positive replies also on marriage. And when we're talking about kosher food inspection, just as well, again, 65% say they would like to see other, they would like to see that the monopoly of the rabbinate revoked. When we're talking about the different strategies taking on these policies, only 35% are content with the fact that the government does not intervene in supplying public transportation. So the disregard strategy is the least popular here. I'm incorporating it a little bit with my conclusions. When we're talking about marriage, only 45.6% say that it is sufficient to allow alternatives to the official marriage, even though it grants them with the rights. So this is somewhere in the middle. And when we're talking about the kosher food inspection, where the government did caused a change in the fringes of the policy, allowing other Orthodox organizations to grant kosher certificates to businesses, you see that this is the highest level of satisfaction, 54.3%. So this study initiated that handling democratic deficits, state institutions manage these deficits using different strategies. All of them by state institutions aim to keep policy intact. We can see that the accommodation of under the threshold alternatives, just as in marriage policy, really satisfies citizens, yet it disregards the high cost of institutional change. And important to say that the alteration between disregard and the partial institutional modifications has a lot to do with the existence of veto players, because the modification in kosher regulation only happened when the recent government, more pluralistic in a way, government took office. Finally, the levels of satisfaction with these strategies shows us that Robert Dahl's statement on the characteristic of democracy, that designs and preferences should align, still stands. and that religion may be in fact used as a paradigmatic case study. And important for me to say, this is a positivistic study, but in a normative inquiry, when would management seize, and we will see an actual change in policy. This is, of course, will happen when it will become, the realignment of policy will become an existential necessity, like in the case of public transport and current climate crisis. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this interesting talk. And as we don't have much time, I will go swiftly to the next panelist. Thank you, Laura, for the head-ups that you have to leave soon. So the floor is yours, and the presentation will be on the Israeli management of the Western Wall.
Okay, I hope everyone sees this.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, oops, wait, this is not moving. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Western Wall. I also am concerned about the democratic deficit and the management of religion and state affairs. In the past, I've worked on different kinds of models and examined the way decisions are made in other countries and in other ways. And I was interested in taking another kind of example, not from the status quo, and seeing how decisions were made and how they worked and how this important site in Israel has been managed. I'll start by giving a little bit of history because I think it's important to understand the role that this place made, and then it becomes even more striking, I think, the changes that have been made in the way this place is run. So wait a second, let me see if I can. Okay, so I'll just be talking historically about it as a religious site, and then it was morphed, it was changed into a national symbol, became a point of a clash for the national movement, and then part of the international dispute. And in a sense, it really paralleled the development of the Zionist movement and the emergence of the state. But more recently, what we've seen, I'll be claiming, is that if we follow the decisions that have been made, it's been moving back into a religious site and also out of the realm, basically, of the democratic process, which has left the state rather in a kind of anarchy. So the question I'll be asking was what policy was decided upon, what criticisms were there, and what was the implementation like? And then asking the question, which as I mentioned, I think one can conclude, I hope from what I'll show, is the question, are the policy and its implementation within the realm of Israeli democracy? I mean, is our state and religious relations within the country, or are they in some isolated other place? So as a religious site, I mean, the Western Wall became an important site for Jews sometime in the 17th century. Apparently, it was recognized, and there are things written about it in the times of the Ottoman Empire and the British Mandate, that people began to pray there for, I'll just explain briefly that what's called the Western Wall and was once called the Wailing Wall was part of the supporting wall of the temple. That was the most important site for Jews for many times, and Mark Twain wrote about it and talked about people would gather to weep there. And as I said, it was a very clearly religious site. This is what it looked like once upon a time. But what ended up happening as the Zionist movement developed and presented itself as a national movement for many people, especially the key leaders, as an alternative to a religious movement, it was used as a symbol for the new nation. So here you have actually invitation to the first Zionist conference in 1897, and you can see on the left, there's a picture of the wall there, and people kissing it and so forth, and it was brought in as part of the national ethos. Here also you see on the right, on the top right, in a greeting card that was printed in 1932, it was kind of co-opted into the national ethos. And it also became, following along the Zionist tract and the development of the state of Israel, it became a center of clashes, and actually under the mandate, it became a real focus of a lot of attentions, and there was the worst rioting that had been known between Arabs and Jews in 1929 there. In a period in August in 1929, there are 133 Jews and 116 Arabs killed in clashes over this site. Subsequently, it became an international dispute, as I'll explain. I found in an autobiography by the person who was the chief rabbi in the army, a terrible description of what he said. The original plan in Israel in 67 was not to bring Jerusalem into the war, but the Jordanians attacked, there was a response, and then this rabbi who was also in the army, was an officer in the army, described that when he came to the wall, he saw a ceramic sign on which it was written in Arabic and English, Al-Burak, which was the name of Muhammad's horse, and how he took it and smashed it to pieces. So what had started a religious site was co-opted into the national ethos, and then became part of the international program. And now this is kind of surprising because as I said, the original Zionist movement was was basically a secular movement. These are some of the first ideas. The leaders were secular, most of the citizens were secular, the founding documents were secular, even the Declaration of Independence doesn't mention God except in kind of a way that it's sort of hidden the rock of Israel. And if you look at the leadership up until our current prime minister, all the prime ministers were secular. Begin, you'll see, is the only one you could say who's an exception, who became prime minister in 77 and started his first day as prime minister, going to the wall. And here you see him with the kippah, but all the others were secular. So what is described in this kind of, I think, distressing description of the Six-Day War, this same rabbi tried to convince the chief of staff to go and attack and take over the old city, even though it wasn't a plan. And here I just take the quote. He said, "I'm a soldier and I obey orders," and he refused, but eventually it did happen, and this is the same man. I won't go into all the details, but what I've been working on for most of this is finding both accounts of what happened and decisions and discussions in the Knesset. There's also a very important decision here that was published, a statement by the prime minister in 1967, who gave out instructions on June 7th, when the war was still going on, saying that the arrangements in connection with the Western Wall should be determined by the chief rabbis. As with the other places, which is kind of surprising, and this brings us on to the next step, which is that he apparently thought that was a safe way, and he, as previous prime ministers, thought that the religion was kind of dying out and he could give it to them to handle and it wouldn't matter. But what ended up happening is, if this is what the wall looked like before, the whole area was raised to make it into more accessible and so forth. And what we ended up happening there, also, as I said, most of my work now is in the archives, trying to understand what happened. But basically the whole treatment of the wall was taken away from the Knesset and from the democratic process given to this rabbi, and these orders were given out to reconstruct the place. Now, this is again strange, not only because usually democratic powers don't relinquish their control so quickly, but also because, as I noted, all the documentation indicated that the country would be basically secular, and the decisions and relevant material up until then, including the documents, all said that there would be free access to all religious places. It's written in the Declaration of Independence. It existed in the documents in what was the Constitution that wasn't passed. It was written in the statement by the Prime Minister. And yet what ended up happening here also, the Minister of Religious Affairs, who came and was asked about requests by the Reform movement to come and pray by the wall, who were in conflict with the rabbi who was given control, he refused. And there were repeated questions in the Knesset about the growing diversion between the management of this very important national site and the policy. So this was one example in June, but there were repeating questions. There was another question from someone who is from the right. There were questions from the left who is also saying it's the dearest national asset to all the people. If we want to be a symbol for all the people, it must draw people of all types. It's to be if it is to be a place of prayer, that should be discussed, but it should be a source of unity. So here again, we have growing pressure within the Knesset to make sure that what happened is what is going on by the Western Wall, this important system, is in keeping with the decisions of the Knesset, with the decisions of the Prime Minister, and yet we see more and more the control is more extreme. Here we also have another comment, part of another discussion in the Knesset about the Western Wall being a national religious asset. We have another letter by another minister increasing information that there is awareness that this is being taken away. Sorry?
Someone is unmute, so there is like a noise. So if everybody can just mute themselves. Yeah. I think it's Joanna that we heard her conversation. So, or maybe the Artur, maybe you can mute all. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And
So
5 more minutes.
Okay. So what I wanted to show, again, I'm finding more and more discussions in the Knesset and in subcommittees and committees of people complaining that what is happening is not in keeping with the decisions, is not in keeping with what this national asset should be. And there are more and more issues. There are questions that are raised about the relative size of the women's and men's sections because the wall is divided between men and women, which it had not been previously. There are growing restrictions on the people who can come there and have events. There are prohibitions against women bringing Torah scrolls in. There are directives. They've arrested people for women who are wearing religious prayer shawls that were not in keeping with what this rabbi and the people who are running with it said. There was a decision in 2014 to create a mixed area where men and women could be together. It was not implemented. It was also decided and brought up and advanced by the Jewish Agency, this international body. It was discussed in the Supreme Court. And here again, as I said, what we have is policy decisions by all possible bodies from the Knesset and up, from the courts, from the Prime Minister, and the things are in a total disconnect and the management is not carrying out the directives. And that is the situation to this day. I also looked at some figures, as did Niva, about people's attitudes and how this works in other spheres of religion, religious affairs in Israel. And we see that in just about every sphere of religious management, there is great dissatisfaction if it's about public transportation or any of the things that Niva mentioned. My dates here are from 2018 and 19. There's great dissatisfaction, and there's also growing criticism with the way things are being handled at the Western Wall, which is this important system. This parallels what happens in things like education. I won't go into this mark here, but I will show perhaps if I have a chance. No, I think I won't show it. I'll just explain. This is videos from just last week where you can see that there are attacks and there are physical clashes and have been in recent weeks between members of Knesset from different parties who all come and disagree about how things should be managed. Why is this not working? The question is, what can we see from this? I was trying to figure out if maybe there was just a change in policy, but what it seems is that What happened in this case was perhaps because of naivete. There are various ways of explaining it. There was a policy decided upon, but control was relinquished very quickly, and the whole management of the Western Wall was basically taken out of the democratic process. There are all kinds of criticisms made, including from the right and the left, that challenge the results, that express their dissatisfaction, growing internal divisions. I don't map this out here because I'm just presenting the more the historical side than the theoretical one. But even the different parties that were critical of what happened, they moved and changed their backing to the religious, some of the religious positions, even though initially ideologically they should not have been there. And if I look at the implementation, was it successful? No, there's growing anarchy with decisions being beyond the realm of the democratic system. So what can we learn from this? We can say, I think if we look at it from a structural point of view, that what we have in Israel is a system where not only is are there clashes between religion and state, but there is a joining of religious forces, in this case, in the case of the wall, very extreme religious forces, in a kind of Hobbesian model where the political system rests on religious backing rather than on democratic support. And I think that's a worrisome thing. As I said, I come more to this issue from the philosophical political structure. But as I said, I think this is an example of where you can see how, in a sense, I would say Israel is going back a few hundred years. And rather than presenting, as let's say Spinoza or other people said, seeing a legitimacy being drawn from the democratic process, we have a political sphere that is is taking itself out of the democratic process and looking to religious authorities to gain support, and basically neglecting and putting aside the whole democratic process. There's we have, as I said, a lot of what I have and I'm still working on is getting archival material that shows all the kind of disgruntlement and displeasure that is still not found any path to effect, because the whole system seems to have removed from the system, from the democratic process.
Thank you very much. Really a lot of information. We're looking forward to more of the analysis of this document. Laura, how much more time do we have? Are you staying till the end of this panel?
I have about 20 minutes. I have to leave about 4:45, something like that.
If you read and Niva would agree, we can have a small discussion about your presentation now. So, because I think it's important to discuss all of the papers, and then we will get back to the Irid with her paper, and then the discussions about the two other texts. Is it okay with you?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I see that Raphael wants to ask a question.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's very interesting. What is missing, and I would welcome to you to do this, is to provide some sort of suggestion on two issues. Generally, issue about the status of the Western Wall, who should manage it in a way that you see fit to a pluralistic society, because you mentioned that a lot of the decisions are taken by the Orthodox rabbi who is in charge of the Western Wall. And this rabbi does not represent necessarily all the Jews of Israel or all the Jews, because it's supposed to be open to all Jews of the world. And we know that in North America, for instance, the Reform movement is far more strong than the Orthodox. This rabbi is quite hostile to them. And so one issue is about the administration of the wall at large, what do you suggest? And the second thing is how to resolve this issue of the women of the wall that you mentioned a few times during your presentation. And indeed, every week we have another event there at the Western Wall in which people are clashing around this thing. One side support equality, gender equality, and the right of women to pray as they wish in the holiest places place in the Jewish world. And as you said, it's supposed to symbolize unity of the people and not to be a source of division. And so what do you suggest how to resolve this conflict, and how can it be resolved? So I want, besides the description, I would like to have a distinct voice where you are situated, how you reflect on the issues, and whether you find any solution or you propose any solutions that can bring us forward. Thank you.
Okay, well, I can say that I think the way it was originally set out, and there are 3 different laws that talk about religious freedom and access to religious places, and they all outline the way things should be worked, and say by declaring laws about religious access, you would think that the decisions would be made in the Knesset. And what has been happening is that these decisions have been made elsewhere. That is, there's I think a democratic deficit would be mild. We have had for now, at least 2 decades, a complete separate, undemocratic way of working this. As far as the women of the wall are concerned, there's a solution and a decision that was made by the government in 2014 about a solution about building a 3rd area. So there'd be a women's area, a men's area, and a mixed area, which incidentally was also proposed in 1968, but wasn't implemented. So I think what should happen is those things should be done. They should follow the law, they should follow the government decision, and it should happen. Up till now, because, as I said, of a decision, I would say, by the cabinet, especially by the prime minister, these decisions have been ignored. As I said, the way I see it is a way of looking at the source of power of these religious groups as an alternative to democratic legitimacy. So what I would hope would happen is that the current government or some future government would go back to a democratic system in the field of religion as well, and reject this kind of Hobbesian marriage that we have between political and religious elites that are kind of holding the rest of the democracy captive on these issues.
Thank you once again. I don't see the questions in the Q&A, so I think it's time to move to Irit.
Okay.
And we have a paper on the designing public health policy in Israel, which seems to be not to the topic religious state issues, but if you read into the abstract of these presentations, yes, there are quite important religious issues involved.
Will come into it, yeah, and maybe even if you know, in a continue to Laura, maybe it will even present like 2 laws that will be very interesting of the relationship between state and religious. Okay, so I should start. Go ahead. Just a minute. Here, you see my presentation?
Good.
Okay. So designing public policy has been a challenge for the state of Israel since its founding. The definition of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, here it's come, and its multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith character makes shaping public policy a challenging task. In today's lecture, I will be focusing on the challenge of shaping public health policy in Israel. Health policy here we go. Health policy presents a uniquely fascinating nexus of science, medicine, religion, and society. Advances in medical science and technology in the modern era have led to significant breakthrough in the field of medicine and at the same time have created ethical dilemmas about their proper use. Many modern medical practices have provoked intense debate in Israeli society, reflecting conflicts between liberal and Jewish values. In most cases, the debate is complicated by the range of conflicting views within the intra-Jewish discourse, which is itself far from monolithic. How then can legislation take into consideration such a wide range of views? And what price is exacted by the by the decision to take the society's pluralism into consideration or by the decision to disregard it. I would like to speak today of two main possible approaches to shaping public policy on controversial issues. Both recognize the diversity of view in society and both seek to deal with the controversy and resolve it by legislation. They differ in their approach to dealing with the controversy. The first approach is to legislate a uniform law by selecting one of the competing positions as basis for legislation, thus effectively excluding the controversy from the legal level. The advantage of this is the creation of clear, unequivocal, really understood legislation, which promote order and social stability. The underlying conception behind this approach is that law serves as a means of achieving goals and guiding objectives of society, and thus that legislation should be constructed in a way that will achieve these goals and objectives, even if the position selected even if the position selected to be recognized by the law does not reflect reality. Meaning, as long as the selected position resolves issues and promotes social order, it is justifiable to use it as the basis for legislation. An obvious objection to this approach is that a law based on a legal fiction is not legitimate because it is disregard reality, and public policy should be based on true definition, not false one. Another objection touched on how effectively this approach achieved the goal. Does creating legal fiction effectively promote social order? If the public refuses to comply with the legal fiction and creates workaround, the law does not achieve the social order which justified selecting this position. The second approach is to accommodate the controversy and take the diverse points of view into consideration within the framework of the law. I will call it pluralism by definition, or agreeing to disagree. A common way of doing this is to delineate a uniform policy, but to legally approve practices consistent with the alternative positions. A legal mechanism for such an approach would be a conscience clue, allowing individuals to act in accordance with their worldview, even when those differ from the legal default. The foundation for this approach is the aspiration to respect the moral codes of diverse groups in society and individuals who adhere to them, and to recognize and accommodate moral subjectivism. The main objection to this approach concerns social order. Recognizing moral pluralism in the context of public policy, it is claimed, is equivalent to recognize the conflict within the society, which is actually a failure to deal with the issue and leads to tensions and instability in practice. Let's see now how these approaches play out in practice in Israel. To this end, I will present two laws that were passed governing controversial issues: the Brand Priority Death Act and the Israeli Dying Patient Act. Both laws seek to deal with complex biological life and end issues. Both aroused heated debate in Israeli society, and both were enacted following years-long discussion among diverse groups of Israeli society representing the conflict between liberal values and religious values. Both issues are also aroused lively internal debate within the halachic discourse, which intensified the wider debate. The first, the Israeli Dying Patient Act, was intended to regulate medical treatment of terminally patients in a manner that would respect the patient's wishes to not receive life-extending medical treatment, balancing the value of the sanctity of life with the principle of autonomy and the value of the quality of life. The issue of treatment for terminally ill patients has always raised ethical dilemmas, but with the development of medical technology in the modern era, which enables the extension of these patients' life, but often while compromising their quality of life, the dilemmas have intensified and the following debates have been stormy. After years of attempts to settle the issues, in 2000, a public committee was established headed by Professor Rabbi Avram Steinberg. The committee included professional figures representing the range of viewpoints in Israeli society, divided into 4 subcommittees. medical, scientific, philosophical, moral, legal, and halachic. The legislation adopted was based on the following principles. The law established an absolute prohibition on active euthanasia, including assisted suicide and medical treatment intended to cause death or whose probable outcome will be the death of the patient, even when the patient has expressed that this is his or her wish. The law permits, however, withholding life-extending, or in the halachic terms, death-impending medical treatment in cases where the terminally ill patient is suffering greatly and does not wish to receive life-extending medical treatment. Alongside this, the law does not permit cessation of continuous treatment if such cessation is likely to cause the patient's death, for example, disconnecting from the life support machine, even if this is the wishes of the patient. However, the law permits to refrain from renewing continual medical treatment which was unintentionally stopped. It also permits refraining from renewing cyclical therapy, such as was planned a priori to be administered cyclically, like dialysis. Moreover, cyclical therapy is defined by law both in its simple sense of therapy that is administered in a cyclical manner and with planned breaks, but also in the broader sense of therapy that was planned in advance using appropriate technologies to be administered as cyclical therapy, even if it was intended to be administered continually with breaks in its nature. In other words, the practical significance of the legal definition is that it is permissible to withhold life support machine from the patient, but not to disconnect the machine if the patient is already connected to it. But the law does permit changing the manner of treatment by life support machine from continual to cyclical therapy, and it would then be permissible to refrain from renewing the operation of the life support machine at the end of each cycle of therapy. In practice, then the life support machine could be set on a timer, which would stop its operation automatically at a predetermined time, when it would be permissible to refrain from renewing its operation. In this way, the legislator sought to balance the conservative religious approach opposing any kind of euthanasia, active and passive alike, with the secular liberal approach which advocates acting in accordance with the autonomous wishes of the patient and allowing euthanasia. In terms of halachic tradition, the law appears to reject the most conservative approach and adopt the more lenient view, which allows for ways of leading to the end of the patient life in certain circumstances by refraining from renewing life-extending medical treatment. With this mechanism, which bases the law on one elected position out of many, successfully promote the social order and stability it sought to, there are several reasons to suppose that it is not entirely so. Firstly, the mechanism in the law which allows to connect the life support machine to the timer leads to the sense of a legal fiction intended to allow the cessation of the life support machine operation despite the legal prohibition against it. This raises the question whether there is an ethical distinction between an active act and omission when the outcome is identical. Even if we assume that there is an ethical distinction, there remains some doubt regarding the definition of the mechanism permitted by law connecting the life support machine to a timer and refraining from renewing its operation. Can this really be defined as permitted omission, or does this more closely fit the category of active act deed? Secondly, it is practical matter of fact that the law did not successfully produce the clarity and social order it aspired to. Studies show that while many doctors are aware of the legal prohibition to disconnecting the life support machine, they are critical of the arrangement adopted in the legislation and use creative workaround to respect the wishes of the patient to be disconnected from the life support machine and not prolong the patient's life. The second law I would like to present is the Brain Priority Death Act, which demonstrate the second approach for shaping the public policy that take the ethical pluralism into consideration with the framework of the law. This law is intended to settle the question of determining the moment of death in Israeli law. The very name of the law, hints the stormy debates regarding the criteria for determining death. Comparable laws in other countries suffice with the title brand death, whereas Israeli law emphasized that determining the death required respiratory death as well. This seemingly small addition reflects a years-long debate regarding the criteria for determining the moment of death. While the medical scientific community already pushed for recognized brand death as a reliable criteria for determining death in 1967, it took around 40 years for this recognition to be grounded in Israeli law. This delay was the result of internal halachic debate surrounding the criteria for determining death. Since the criterion for brand death only rose to consideration in the modern era, it is unsurprising that it is not mentioned in the ancient halachic sources. Thus, in the view of some of the leading halachic authorities of the 20th century, it could not be considered reliable criterion. Rather, the determination of death must wait for the cessation of the heart activity, which is noted in the ancient halachic sources as a necessary criterion for determining death. Others of the leading halachic authorities of the same era argues that the cessation of breathing is a sufficient criterion for determining of death according to those very same sources. And since the cessation of brain stem activity necessarily indicates the irreversible cessation of breathing, then the criterion of brain death should be recognized as a modern indication of the cessation of breathing, which is the traditional halachic criterion for determining the moment of death. Time being short, I will not describe here the details of the halachic debate or the nature of the Israeli debate between the rabbinic and the medical establishment. I will just mention that they took about 40 years until the enactment of the brain respiratory death act, whose main points are those. The law recognized brain death as a reliable criterion for determining the moment of death. The law states that in order to be authorized to determine brain death, physicians will be required to take a course on a legal, ethical, and halachic background to the subject. In addition, the law gives authority to a medical public follow-up committee to oversee brain death determining process, which include representatives of medical doctors, chief rabbiniate, and experts from the fields of law, ethics, and philosophy. Finally, the legislator wants to balance the legal recognition of the brain death criterion and the controversy in Israeli society surrounding this criterion. Thus, along with the legal recognition of the brain death, Israeli law determines the obligation to take into account the wishes of individuals who think differently. In a special section, the legislator makes an exception for the people who oppose the concept adopted in the law and allows them to die according to cardiac criteria or according to their conscience. If this mechanism a recipe for success, it seems this model is not free from difficulties either. Here are a few examples. So it appears that legal recognition of ethical pluralism leads to ethical dilemmas in the equal distribution of medical resources. In light of the legal recognition of brain death, it is not clear how it would be ethical to allocate purchased medical resources, such as medical staff, hospital beds, life support machines, to patients who are considered legally dead, but prefer to not be disconnected from the life support machine in accordance with their conscience, since those resources will thus be unavailable for treating still living patients. I will skip on this, I have no time. And we'll go to the third one. Legal recognition of ethical pluralism also leads to lesser clarity on the definition of death, leading to legal and social instability. So, for example, the question whether one who caused brain death to another person can be charged with murder, despite the fact that in his view, brain death is not considered death, meaning in his view, he did not cause the death. Difficult medical issues also arise due to the sense that the law creates a paradox by enabling a situation where medical treatment is given to a person who has been declared dead. In conclusion, shaping public policy in a pluralistic, multicultural society is a challenge that Israel has been dealing with since its establishment and will apparently continue to face in the future. Today, we saw two models for dealing with the shaping of public policy on controversial issues by studying two laws concerning weighty issues of life and death. Both laws were enacted after years of debate over the issues they wished to settle. Both results from years-long deliberation involving diverse elements of Israeli society. Each of them is based on a different model of dealing with controversies in Israeli society, and neither one seems to be free of difficulties. However, they both were achieved by substantive discourse between different groups of Israeli society and of the belief in the necessity to lead this kind of discourse. Each demonstrate an attempt to shape public policies that can deal with the diversity of viewpoints and reach compromise that will enable coexistence in multicultural society. As such, they represent an important breakthrough.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for keeping up with time. If anybody wants to ask questions from the audience, you can do that with the Q&A on our chat or also on our chat box. And I see that we already have questions from the panelists. So Professor Cohen.
Thank you, Artur. And thank you, Niva. Thank you very much for the presentation. For Niva, I just suggest that you put it forward. What do you suggest? What do you want to achieve? What is the aim? How can we do that? What will be a solution to the problems that you noted? And these things sort of should rhyme throughout your presentation, throughout your article. With regard to Irit, I don't have any question, but I just want to make some comments that I think are important for your paper. I was a member of the Steinberg Committee, so I know firsthand how it worked, and I know firsthand what was the reasoning and what's the rationale behind this and so on. One thing that you need to understand, that if you come to make such a decision to comprise such a committee to decide end-of-life issues, in any other country, it will be reasonable to assume that there will be some sort of a committee that will study medicine. So there will be, a subcommittee on medicine. It also be reasonable to think that there will be subcommittee on law, just because it's supposed to be a law at the end of the day. So you need to have legal minds to see how you can phrase and frame this in a legal way. It's also because of the nature of the thing, you'd assume that it should be some sort of philosophical committee to study the ethical and moral issues. And all of them were present in Israel when the committee was comprised in 2000. However, it was also decided, and this is because the Minister of Health at the time, Nissim Dahan, was from Shas, that there will be a Halachic committee. Now, once you introduce a Halachic committee, you can understand where it's going to move. And then it's like trying to move forward with shackles on your legs, because anything that you want to move in a liberal way, you'll be restrained. So that was inbuilt sort of impossibility. And then it was up to us to try to square the circle, which is quite difficult, because we knew that is anything that I was in the philosophy committee, of course, anything that we propose that will be more so-called adventurous or liberal is going to be toppled by the Halachic committee, because Abraham Steinberg, a religious man, would like to have a consensus, and he was pushing very hard for a consensus. There are two things that you need to understand, I think, that are very important. One is that when Asa Kasher, the chair of the subcommittee, in agreement with the committee, heard that there would not be any representations to non-Jews, what he decided with the agreement of Avraham Steinberg and the agreement of the subcommittee is to enlarge the scope of the philosophical committee. So from then on, it was called Philosophy and Values. And when values introduced, this was a sort of a key term to introduce other non-Jewish people into the committee. So this enabled us, the entire committee, it was in the consensus of the subcommittee to invite Arabs and Christians and Druze into the committee. One of each, but at least there was some sort of representation. I don't think that they played much role, but symbolically, they were not left outside, and this is important. Secondly, important to understand that what we try to do is to find a way that can empower the autonomous decision-making of people, and at the same time, to respect halacha, Jewish law. So what is missing in your presentation is all the machinery of living wills and advanced directives that we put a lot of emphasis in order for people to voice an opinion and to be involved, actively involved, not passively involved, but actively involved as a participant, together with doctors, with all the medical staff around the patient's bed, that we can say what we want. And I think this is extremely important. And the third thing that is important to note, and that's the difference between discretionary and continuous treatment, is according to halacha, according to Jewish law, you should not stop treatment. It's simply in the Jewish law. It's not something, and of course, if you are Orthodox, there's nothing you can do about it. You cannot change halachic law. It's impossible for them to do. So this is why we originated the idea of Sharon Shabbat, of the Sabbath clock that you can put on timers on ventilators. And when the time stops, then it becomes discrete and then it's non-continuously. Now, I understand that there were some problems in implementing this idea, but we wanted to resolve this problem and empower more decision-making on the part of the patients. And I think this is important because, yes, we are not going to allow assist suicide or euthanasia. That the halachic committee would sabotage immediately. But it does empower citizens in Israel more than they could have done before 2005. And I think this is important.
Someone else want to ask, or can I?
Yeah, well, Niva and Irit, if you want to respond with Raphael.
So I would just say, Raphael, thank you for all your comments. I will just say that, of course, all the main, part of the law talking about the advanced directive, of course, it is very important. My presentation here focused on that case where also the law take this case of those who didn't sign, on the advanced directive, and we don't know what was explicit their wishes. So that's the point I was focused on in this presentation. Yeah, but I'm accepting your comments. And regarding your last comment on the halacha, I'm not sure that I accept in your definition that according to the Jewish law, there is no way to latir action of stop, the life support machine. I mean, there is variety of attitudes in the halachic, in the Jewish halachic tradition, and some of them, as you probably know, you can take them as basis for say that maybe, it's not me. There is some leading of the biggest rabbi in the 20th century, like Rav Chaim David Halevi, that say that taking the life support machine is the equivalent example for from taking the salts from the lashon of the patient, which mentioned in the halacha. So it's not the mainstream, but there is some attitude that we called in the halachic terms, as I mentioned, hasarat hamonea in Hebrew, that could play with this direction. But I know, you know better than me what was the discussion, but thank you for your comments.
Thank you. And Niva?
Thank you, Rafi, for your comment. And I think perhaps this should be my next step for the conclusion part, thinking of how to bring forward. For now, I've said that this is a normative inquiry on when would the state institutions stop managed policies and then go to policy modification. So at least for the public transport policy, I believe that due to climate crisis and the crowded roads in the country, when it will become an existential necessity, and I think it's soon to come, then policy will need to change. And I really need to think of the other two strategies and when should they stop to exist and become a change in policy. Just one comment, if I may, to Irit. Despite not focusing on your specific case study, I've written an article, published article already on rabbis in government hospitals and the way they manage and the way they become actually policy entrepreneurs in the process of providing religious services in government hospitals, and the relationships between other medical staffs and the rabbis and the place halakha takes in it. It's a very interesting realm, and I guess you could see that, you could even look at it in a very comparative manner of different services, religious services provided to patients. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and we have one more question from Noy.
Thank you. Actually, it's a small comment to Niva.
Yeah, please.
So you mentioned your talk was very fascinating. You hear me? I hear my self voice. Never mind. So you mentioned two alternatives of marriage that don't connect to legislative initiative. You mentioned marriage conducted abroad and cohabitation. So you might want to think about also about the third alternative, which is the practice of unofficial, private, religious Jewish marriage taking place outside and against the chief rabbinate authority. And what is, I think, is interesting in this alternative, which imposes a threat, I think, on the dominant religious institution of marriage, because this third alternative is religious, as opposed to the two other alternatives that you mentioned. And the additional question is your question: how the state address this, engage with these subversive alternatives.
So thank you so much, Noy. This is actually on spot. Indeed, I've just exemplified 2 or 3 options, but of course there's so many others. And how does the state address this? Well, in 2013, the state declared that couples conducting private Orthodox weddings, the couple and the rabbi are going to jail for 2 years. So this is how the state addresses it in coercion. Again, many alternatives. I would love to talk about it later if we have the time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but unfortunately, the time is up, the time is over. And I also have several questions, just like with the last panel. I have a list of them here, so probably I'll be mailing them to all the speakers in the following days. So thank you all. And I see that there is the common theme also between this and the previous panel, with the engagement of the public, of the expert bodies, of the religious bodies in the decisions of the public policies. So maybe that is something also that we should keep in mind when we will be talking about the future publication. But that is for the future, and for now we have a 15 minutes break. So thank you all once again, and we will meet the same place in 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Admit myself.
This meeting is being recorded.
I'm also very much interested in this specific public policy. If we assume, or if we agree that energy policy is a public policy, but to, of course, great extent it is. Without delay, let us pass the floor to Sujata.
Hi, everyone.
Sujata is an expert from India, and she is an author of a book published, if I'm not mistaken, 2018. 2019 on actually energy related issues, but from the geopolitical perspective. And she's going to present a paper titled The Evolution of Israel's Natural Gas Policy, Nature and Processes. So Sujata, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Joanna. This is my book, Israel's Natural Mediterranean Gas, Domestic Governance, Economic Impact, and Strategic Implications. It was published in 2019, and much of what I'm going to talk about is drawn from this book and suitably updated. So I'm going to share a screen with all of you. I share my PowerPoint with you. Let me. Is it visible to everyone?
Yes.
Is the screen visible? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to begin with, give an introduction to my paper, and then I'll talk about how gas development in Israel took place. What are the various committees that Israeli government established to frame a regulatory policy on the gas resource. And then we are going to see how these committees are, were a demonstration of the democratic functioning of the political system. So let me begin by saying that in the Israel discovered natural gas in about 20 years ago now, 30? More than 20 years ago. So initially the field that was gas field that was discovered in the Eastern Mediterranean was was a very a small field, about 20 billion BCM, billion cubic meters of gas, which is not a very large amount. It is a relatively small amount of gas. This particular field went into production in 2004. And in 2004, it was the first time that gas in commercial quantities were introduced into the Israeli domestic, Israeli market, Israeli electricity market to begin with. And gas is used for many other purposes as well in Israel, but electricity is what takes up about 80% of the gas use in the country. So this was a small field. Its expected life span was about 10 to 15 years. So this particular field did not drive any regulatory changes or existing regulatory changes in the gas market. Now, significantly, the field developers paid only 18% of what was called the company tax, and they claimed something called the depletion deduction, which I'm going to discuss a bit later. They paid about 12.5% of royalties on the gas resource, but on exploitation of resource. But this was offset by the depletion deduction. Now, with the discovery of the giant Tamar field, about 300 BCM of gas, and the supergiant Leviathan field with about 600, a little more than 600 BCM of gas in 2009 and 10, this brought the gas governance and regulatory issues to really the forefront of Israeli policy making. During that time, we saw a lot of public debates on the utilization of gas in the domestic economy, about export and other aspects of regulatory aspects of the resource. So in the subsequent years, Israel created a regulatory regime for gas and implemented several policy measures aimed at establishing a regulatory framework for what is known as exploration and production. Now, exploration and production is the entire value chain in the gas industry, right from the upstream to midstream and downstream. So production is just not extracting gas. Production is also about, refining that gas, then sending that gas to the through the pipelines to the consumers. So so exploration and production is an entire value chain that was brought under a harmonized regulatory framework, you can say. So Israeli regulatory regime on gas as it evolved is defined by 5 characteristics. And I talk about the gas development by private players, the public policy formation, the policies were a two-way process, not just by the ministries, but the people were intimately involved in the in policy making. Third, the emphasis on state ownership of the resource through a certain kind of taxation that we are going to talk about. And then you had, again, through a committee, you had the prioritization of domestic consumption over export. And that was a result of the public policy formation of the regulatory framework on gas. And then I'll also talk a bit about the sovereign fund from gas proceeds and how Israel intends to use the sovereign fund for infrastructure or development of the state. So first of all, in the entire gas story, I want to emphasize that gas development in Israel is through private players. Now, early in the early 1990s, when gas wasn't discovered in commercial quantities, Israeli government, Israeli political elites, you can say, took the ideological and political decision to develop the E&P sector, the exploration and production center, the entire value chain, through private companies, through state-owned, rather than through state-owned companies. So there is no national energy company in Israel. And if you contrast this to other gas producers in the world, except for the US, you have a national energy company which manages the government stakes in the gas sector. You have national energy company in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Those are massive big gas players, but even smaller ones like Denmark, you have a national energy company. So, but Israeli government took the decision to develop the entire gas industry through private players. So the government, it is not as if Israel didn't have a national energy company. It did have a national energy company, but in the early 1990s, the government deregulated the entire petroleum sector. Now, it was also a manifestation of the neoliberal reforms of the day. To encourage private, domestic and foreign investments. Now, at that point of time, not the foreign investments because of the conflict, the foreign investments were not coming into gas or into Israeli petroleum sector. So to encourage the private sector into gas industry, the entire industry from the word go was deregulated. State holdings in the government-owned Israel National Oil Company was completely sold off, mainly because of the financial losses and the limited success of the company, but also because the government wanted to invite private players and private entrepreneurs into the gas industry. Now, the Petroleum Law of 1952 was revised in this context to encourage private players, and they were given incentives also in the form of what I have called depletion deduction. Now, in 2002, after the gas was discovered, a natural gas sector law was passed, which created competitive sector in midstream and downstream phases of the gas industry. This law was again amended in 2007 to bring licensing obligation, basically leasing and performance-based leasing in the transmission, storage, marketing, etc. of these. So midstream again was completely reformulated and privatized. A National Gas Authority was established around the same time, and it was created to oversee the lease and performance of the private sector in the transmission and storage. So these are all parts of the gas regime that was gradually created with the discovery of gas. Now, the second aspect of the policy formulation that I want to talk about is the public policy formation through the establishment of committees. So to tackle the three challenges of taxation, utilization of resource, and monopoly concerns in the Israeli emerging monopoly concerns in the Israeli gas market, the government, Israeli government, at various points established committees which were public, interministerial, and multi-member committees to look into all of these issues. And such committees were more appropriate, considered to be more appropriate than the single department, member committee for formulating a policy on gas on these three issues that I have mentioned, because they involve several regulatory problems and interministerial, cooperation and collaboration. So a multi-member committee or an interministerial committee was considered to be more feasible for formulating the policies required for due to the discovery of large amount of gas in 2009 and 10. Now, it is significant to note that the government did not rely on the in-house work of, say the budget committee or the finance Ministry of Finance, but considered an interministerial committee as an important significant to get all the departments of the government together to formulate the policy on gas. And so these public committees were also, and another reason for the public committees was to increase transparency in policy formulation in a sector that is often marred by shady deals and shady policies. So the Israeli government wanted to have a complete transparency in the policy formulation on the gas issue. Now, the members of these committees heard diverse perspectives on issues relevant to their mandates. And you had interest groups ranging from field developers to environmentalists and health activists, opposition parties, people concerned with commercial aspect of the oil industry, oil and gas industry, appearing before the committees or submitting comments during the periodic meetings of the committees, allowing the members to become acquainted with the various, nuanced, various aspects of, or the nuances of the gas industry. So it was a two-way policy formation process. Now let's look at the first committee that was established relating to the gas industry. The first was the Sessions-Ski Committee, which was appointed in the backdrop of the Tamar discovery. Tamar was a huge discovery, a giant discovery in 2009. And the work of the Ministry of Finance had revealed that Israel's tax on natural gas was among the lowest in the world. So now the discovery was huge, and sorry, and now that that there would be more revenues and turnover from the industry, the government needed to harmonize Israel's taxation system with the prevalent taxation, in the world, in countries which had gas resources. So the Sessions-Ski Committee was tasked by the government to examine the fiscal system related to gas royalties and taxation, and to suggest changes in light of the huge gas discoveries. Now, the head of the committee was Professor Eitan Sessions-Ski. He is a professor in Hebrew University, an economics professor in Hebrew University. And he, along with 5 officials, worked alongside the director of the budget department, Yuri Nissan, I think. And now this committee was, the challenge before the committee was to find a balance between providing adequate benefits to the public and providing adequate incentive to the developers or the entrepreneurs in the gas industry. Now, this balance was very critical, because if you did not incentivize the gas players or the entrepreneurs, then the gas would not be out of the ground. You needed to provide them adequate incentive to be able to make investment into the industry. And oil and gas investment are always risky investments. So the entrepreneurs needed to be certain about the profitability of making an investment into the industry. On the other hand, you had the public who, if it was assumed that the gas belonged to the state, then by extension, it belonged to the Israeli public. So Israeli public needed to benefit from a resource which had been recently discovered, and which could also give rise to other industries related to gas. The revenue from gas could benefit education, healthcare, environmental issues, etc. So it was important, and the government considered it critical that the committee suggests changes that adequately balance the benefits with the incentives. Now, the committee, being a multi-member, worked collaboratively, but also was not averse to seeking outside professional help. So it sought professional help from 2 professors, one from MIT, etc. So there was also a partial outsourcing of policy formulation. Now, this committee invited any interested party to present its position before the committee. And then the committee was able to gather all the information, all the different aspects of views on the gas market or on the taxation, and it submitted its recommendations in November 2010 to the government. Now we are going to talk about committee and then we'll see the specific recommendation and how it helped in the policy formation regarding the gas resource. Now you had now another committee, important committee, was the GMT committee. So it was appointed again in the backdrop of the discovery of a supergiant Leviathan field in December 2010. Now this was a huge gas field, and it raised the prospect of Israel becoming a gas exporter. So in October 2011, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Energy Uzi Landau formed again an interministerial committee regarding the to look into Israeli policy, government's policy regarding the natural gas industry, and again suggest how domestic consumption can be reconciled with export.
Sujata, I think we may just have like a few more minutes.
Okay.
Just to save time. Yeah.
Okay. So, so this was the mandate of the GMT committee. Now, the committee worked in the same manner as the Sessions-Key committee. It invited, there were several public hearings, and interested parties submitted their views before the committee, and the committee also invited international consulting firms, and then submitted its recommendation. So let's look at a specific recommendation of the Sessions-Key committee, which really was something of an innovation in the Israeli gas industry. This was the Sessions-Key tax on the gas industry, meaning that when there is a windfall profit after recouping the investment in the oil industry, the oil developers would have to pay have to pay a levy or tax on excess profit. So after they have recovered about 150% of the invested cost, they would be paying the levy. And Sessions-Key law that came after on the heels of the recommendation of the committee also abolished what is called the depletion deduction. Now, depletion deduction is is often there in a private industry, which indicates the exhaustion of the resource in the field. And since the entrepreneurs had not bought the resource from the state, the resource still belonged to the state. So the depletion deduction was abolished. There was no need for giving the entrepreneurs subsidy because they would be taxed only after they have recouped their investment and made an adequate profit. Now, the GMT committee, one of the signature recommendations of the committee I'll talk about is that it recommended that the natural gas policy must join domestic need with the political objectives of the state. Because if it heard during one of the public hearings that selling gas abroad would enhance Israel's political weight and strategic leverage in the Arab neighborhood. So the committee recommended that natural gas must reconcile domestic need with political objectives of the state. Now I'm going to quickly show you the division that the committee made before to the government. This is the GMT committee recommendation, but the government, due to court challenge, adopted a lower quantity for export. So the recommendations of the committee were 52%, but the government, after the court challenge and when during the hearings, people resisted the fact that the committee was recommending a higher quantity of gas for export. So the government finally adopted, almost reversed the committee's recommendation, but accepted the recommendation that that gas can be and should be exported. Now, this was again revised by another committee, which is the Adiri committee. Since there's paucity of time, I'm going to quickly flag off one of the issues in the antitrust issue. Again, a committee was established, and the antitrust authority, it was recommended that the antitrust authority shear down the stakes of Delek Group, Delek and Noble Energy. These two had monopoly in the Israeli gas market. So they were asked, so the policy was adopted to shear down the stakes of these two groups in the gas industry and to bring in a new player. And then you have Energan coming into the Israeli gas industry. So through policy measures, what I mean to say is through policy measures, Israel was able to attract new players into the gas market and make the gas market more varied. Again, through a committee, again, the establishment of a sovereign fund was recommended. And although the fund is not ready as yet, but it seems until, by the end of 2022, the government will have enough funds collected from the Seshinsky tax to be able to get this fund going. Now, I want to just say, how did public hearing help in policy formulation? This is one of the core aspects of my paper. I can say that it increased transparency as far as policy formation is concerned. A divergent position and perspectives aided the committee in developing policies that reconcile different divergent interests. Now, all contentious issues were discussed and debated openly, so there was no hedging on complicated issues. Greater public understanding of gas ensured that domestic, share of gas for domestic consumption was more than the export. So the greater public understanding of gas, of the gas issues ensured that. And it also created checks and balances to ensure proper gas utilization. I can talk more about it during the Q&A. So in conclusion, one can say that the method of public policy formulation through committees was successful. It created a comprehensive regulatory regime in all aspects of the gas industry. And it was also a demonstration of Israel as a democratic polity. The policy decisions involved were vigorously debated in the public sphere. So public opinion was crucial in shaping policies that ensured people received their fair share of resources and income from the resource. Now, public debates and discussions also ensured that people of Israel benefited first and foremost from the resource, contributing to the energy security of the nation, and by extension to national security, as securing energy has always been one of the state's most important tasks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm not surprised at all, but I'm very happy that this presentation is in a great dialogue with the presentation from two previous panels. And I would say that the issue that connects the presentation, actually elaborating on quite different topics, is once again the role of public opinion, the role of citizens, the engagement and the participatory character of the policy making itself. So thank you very much, Sujata. Let's move quickly to Karolina Zielińska presentation. which will probably explore a different areas of the energy policy topic issue. Karolina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to join this panel and the whole seminar. It is much needed, and it's really wonderful to be here and to hear to all of you. My topic deals with the Israeli policy of preparation, prevention, and response to oil spills on land and sea. I hope you can see my presentation now. Can you see it? Okay, good. So I'm dealing here with a topic which is not much researched so far, little investigated. So what I present now is a bit of a raw material, and also my article is a bit raw still. So I would be very, very grateful for every advice on how to make it better. I rely on publicly available sources in my study, documents produced by the governmental authorities, information from the press, formal documents of other kinds, and I mostly concentrate on the contemporary case studies. In the way I study the public policy making process, I really follow the process itself. So I try to see what are the patterns, what are the key determinants in who decides and how decide and in which way it decides, and what are the actual decisions. I use a little of a comparative approach. This is a long list of features that I actually wrote even before I decided that I will actually concentrate on the oil spill issue. I was just wondering, okay, there is a seminar about Israeli public policies, so what can I say by, from my experience, what are they? And this is how I came up with this list of sometimes contradictory features, which are also sometimes complementary. For example, if I see this sort of inclusiveness, multitude of actors taking part in the creation of public policies in Israel, and I also see the role of the judiciary, I can say that maybe there are some deficiencies in governance produced by the multiplicity of actors, but maybe they are in a way compensated also by the way the judiciary is engaged on a sort of constant level. So here I see, manifold of private actors, also private enterprises, experts and think tanks taking part in policy making, which on the same time is this is a very centralized polity with still local authorities, for example, not having much of a say, not as much as in other countries. At the same time, this policy sometimes lacks strategic planning. Sometimes there are some issues with transparency, and so on and so on. So here I decided that maybe I will study this policy, the way it developed, and then I see if my list of features was somehow relevant for the policy I study. So to start with, some basic information about Israel and the business of oil. The share of oil in the energy mix in Israel declines fast, yet it is still highly reliant, in particular in the transport sector. It is also reliant on imports because there is not much oil found in the land of Israel. There are two oil fields that are operated. There are also two major oil refineries in Haifa and Ashdod, and two major oil terminals in Eilat and Ashkelon, and a network of pipelines which are operated primarily by the Europe-Asia Pipeline Company. This company was created in order to secure the flow of Iranian oil to Israel in late 1960s. Later on, this pipeline was made two-directional. That is because Israel started to import its oil from north, from Central Asia and Russia. So we can also map the potential sources of spills in Israel. This is the oil industry that I just drawn up the picture of it, but also this is the natural gas industry, which was partly presented by the previous speaker.
Sorry to interrupt, Carolina, but we don't see the slides changing. I don't know if you are changing the slides on your computer.
I am. Yes, I am pretty much.
Okay,
how can
maybe you can share once again screen.
Okay.
Maybe it will work now.
Okay,
no,
maybe I.
Okay.
Can you see the list now?
Yes.
Okay.
Israeli public policies. Yes. Thanks.
Okay, good. So to continue, there is also one more source of spills. Oil industry, natural gas industry. When you extract the gas, also some condensates and benzene can be extracted by accident. And the third one is marine transport, very significant source of potential oil spills. The triggers might be technical malfunction, of course, human error, natural cause, or deliberate sabotage or attack. To see how Israel places itself in sort of a comparative perspective, I tried to map out the international frameworks, first the global frameworks applying to the issue of oil spills. So there is this complex framework of international conventions under International Maritime Organization for the marine area. And for soils, for lands, there is also a complex of legislation and conclusions of the United Nations conferences. And Israel is generally in line with all these frameworks, although it didn't ratify all the protocols. I delve into details in my article. Can you see how I switch the slides now? Okay, good. There is also two regional frameworks that are relevant for Israel, and this is related to the Israeli Mediterranean shore and related to the Red Sea shore. So first, let's see the geography of this. There is this very long Mediterranean shore of Israel, which houses most of population and also desalination installations. So this is crucial. And it's also very vulnerable because of the nature of the Mediterranean Sea and the way the wind works and so on, and currents. And also because of this geographical conditions, Israel quite liable to be affected, in particular in the 1970s, when before the pollution was really dealt with, Israeli shore was really polluted with tar. Also on the Mediterranean, you have this huge movement of cargo ships and tankers, which contribute to pollution. So it's not only about gas or oil imports. On the Red Sea shore, on the other hand, you have this very narrow strip of land with both the neighbors also engaged in oil industry. I mean, Jordan and Egypt, very close to Israeli borders and Israeli own industry in Eilat. And of course, the strategic importance of the Red Sea as a gate for trade. These regional frameworks are quite different in the way the Mediterranean system is really well developed, and Israel is part of it from the very beginning. And it was actually one of the countries that really engaged in developing it. Barcelona Convention is the most important one. So it creates a very complex framework that provides standards, reporting, control, compensation mechanisms, and also much regional consultation and cooperative trainings. Within very, very much specialized and dedicated agencies like REMPEC. Also, European Union and European Maritime Safety Agency is quite important, especially for monitoring and response, and also some trainings, some with participation of Israel as well. To the contrary, the Red Sea system is very nascent. There is a regional convention relevant, but Israel is not part of it. And it's because parties to the convention are in most part not countries that would recognize existence of Israel. But still there is some cooperation with Egypt and Jordan through Jordanian Gulf of Aqaba environmental and oil contingency plans. To study the system, you also need to see that there is also, this practice of other states having governmental agencies, private companies that specialize in response to oil spills, civil society organizations, and also industries self-imposing certain standards. And the Israeli system, it's quite complex. Here I listed a long list of laws. Of course, the system was developed historically as a response to imports of oil from Iran first, then Barcelona Convention, and then in this century because of the way the offshore gas discoveries were developed. So we have really many different laws that create these complex systems, providing for environmental assessments, response plans, discharge limits, penalties for violation of law. And also the system is built around many governmental actors or semi-governmental actors, with Ministry of Environmental Protection, the leading one, but also other ministries and agencies and authorities involved. There is also a Marine Pollution Prevention Fund, which is supposed to gather payments by polluters and then spending this money on preparatory actions. Having said all that, there is one big but. Israel didn't adopt a national contingency plan for preparedness and response to combat marine oil pollution. There were 2 drafts prepared, accepted by the government, but never properly legislated. So there was never proper budget allocated to preparedness and response in cases of oil spills.
Carolina, I
Yes.
am very sorry, but I don't want to say we're running out of time, but we would love to save some time for the third presentation and later at least few minutes for a Q&A.
Okay, so I will run through my presentation. In my paper, I describe manifold instances of oil spills, which were mostly small-scale accidents, and also 2 reports by state controller as a sort of an agency that tried to control it all. I also described 2 big disasters. One is Nahal Zin disaster, and another is another disaster from two years later. And the way in which, through these disasters, we see that actually the main culprit was the EAPC. This is the operator of the pipeline from north to south Israel, which had a sort of secrecy of dealings guaranteed through the legal system and the way the whole company was organized. So first Nahal Zin disaster, then Avrona disaster. And the details of the special status of this pipeline company really coming out to the public for the first time, and first time starting to be dealt with by the Knesset and by the government, and also first suits against this pipeline company by various actors. And but also only many years after first decisions by the courts against this company. Okay, I also studied two policy dilemmas that we could observe last year. First, regarding the Tar disaster, which happened in February last year, and here I have this detailed follow-on of the way there was governmental and non-governmental actors' reaction to the Tar disaster, which with the way the official response was organized, but also the way in which volunteers were engaged. And another case study is this discussion yes, let's feel about the deal that the EAPC signed with the Emirates in order to bring much more oil through Eilat and then through Israel to the European buyers. So there was this very, very long discussion with the participation of manifold experts, NGOs, Knesset committee, media, and various politicians about what to do about this deal. And to cut things short, actually the way they found in the end, and also after the High Court was engaged, was to decide that, because everybody was basically calling for the deal to be annulled, but in the end the government decided that the deal will be dealt with by the Ministry of Environmental Protection, and decisions that this ministry can make in order to limit the discharge amounts and other permits related to environment. So in fact, this was a decision, a way not to decide, because this is very easy to be withdrawn. Okay, and then also various other actors like this Directors General Committee. Coming to conclusions, I see in my paper that Israel generally follows Western pattern. Oil spill prevention reaction system is developed together with oil and gas industry, but not so much in reaction to actual spills, which is contrary to the other countries. And we also see that paradoxically, where there is a very strong regulatory framework, there were no spills. And on the other hand, these catastrophes that I just mentioned occurred in cases where state was not able to do much, like the Star disaster, or rather where the states, for these reasons of secrecy and so on, failed to regulate and enforce. And then I must say that in my case studies, I see there is indeed high level of centralizations, insufficient system of national level planning. It basically didn't work. No national contingency plan is still applied. There is a platform of state and non-state bodies included in policy making, a big role of experts and cards, but still there is this avoidance of being decisive, reliance on diluted compromises. Secret dealings, yes, but increasingly less and less tolerated. Much securitizing discourse. And also what is interesting, and that this is not really an example of Israel being a reclusive country. On the contrary, we see that actually policies were developed in the context of international frameworks and in cooperation with international actors. So thank you for your attention. I'll be very happy to hear any comments.
Thank you very much. Before we'll start commenting and giving a feedback to Carolina's paper, let's move to Stefan's, and I have to ask Stefan to keep your presentation quite brief, since we have something like, let's say 25 up to 30 minutes. So let's have a few minutes for discussion. But I know that Stefan can keep the discipline, and we'll be on safe side. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I can be very precise, but if you can give me a number of how precise I should be, I can try to.
So you had 15 minutes. Every speaker had 15 minutes, but if you do it faster, we'll appreciate it really very much.
All right. I will see what I can do. First of all, I might want to make sure that everyone sees the presentation. And I'm not even able to open it. 1 second.
It's fine.
Oh, it's open, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, here we go.
Great.
Now you can see that presentation.
Yep.
And if I change to presenter view, you do not see my notes, or do you see them?
Now we see more.
Okay, that's bad.
But previously it was just a presentation.
All right, then we will do it in a different
But we can
mode.
pretend that we are not reading notes.
So now you can only see that presentation, right? And I changed the slides, perfect.
Okay, yeah.
And then I can secretly view my notes. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you also very much for the two presentations just before me. And after we have heard on Israel and the domestic considerations on natural gas, and also Israel and the environment, let's say, I will take it now to the foreign affairs level. So yes, my name is Stefan Wolfram. I have a background basically in international relations and Arabic, Hebrew, and I was always interested in seeing how several Arab states are talking with Israel and how Israel talks with the Arab states. And I found out that natural gas is quite an interesting explanatory framework. As usual, when you engage in natural gas trade, there is more than only one interaction. So it's a continuous effort. And this economic step to have a cooperation, a trade, let's say, and is a continued trade, will definitely, in my understanding, have an impact on the relation between the two countries. So very quickly, I want to throw some numbers at you. And in order to answer the question, why is it actually advisable for both countries to cooperate? So when you look at Israel, it's getting better now, but Israel had little to no infrastructure and also not really a market for natural gas. So that was like the problem from the outset. No one ever expected that Israel would have these quantities of natural gas on its shores. And when they were found, it was basically a big surprise, and Israel had to start from scratch. Now that's the circumstance for Israel. And for Egypt, on the other hand, Egypt always had fossil fuels and therefore has these two LNG facilities in Idku and Damietta. LNG is liquefaction of natural gas. So very important facilities for export, potential export. And also Israel and also Egypt has found a lot of fossil fuel in the form of natural gas in front of their shore. Now, as Israel produces right now roughly 9 BCM, billion cubic meters per year, Egypt actually has quite a larger reservoir on its shores and ranks actually number 14 in the worldwide gas production in 2021. So that's pretty good. And this actually strikes the question, so why should they cooperate? Israel has no infrastructure and produces a tiny amount of natural gas, while Egypt actually produces a lot of natural gas and also has the facilities. But here comes point 3. Israel has a natural gas surplus, while Egypt actually, even though it's self-sufficient since 2018, actually has the problem that it breaks even. So in 2018, for example, the production in Egypt was around 67 BCM for the whole year, and they consumed 61 BCM for the whole year. So that left them only for 2018 with around 4.5 BCM that they could export. Now, if you look at the amount that Israel produces, and the amount that Israel actually exports to Egypt is 3.5 BCM per year. So that almost doubles the Egyptian possibility to export natural gas. And this is basically where I start my PhD research. This is actually what's interesting to me, that Israel and Egypt are trading in natural gas, even though when viewed separately, it doesn't really make sense, and they both have political realities that make it difficult to cooperate, but they still do. And then by extension, I'm interested in seeing if there is any sort of change in political behavior. So if there is an economic cooperation that's ongoing, as I said in the beginning, will this actually have an effect on policy in the both countries? So the question always leads to why is this economic cooperation limited? So for example, if you have this natural gas trade, It has been said many times that it's a catalyzer for regional cooperation. There's many things that can be said. There is, first of all, the increasing cooperation between Israel and Egypt on the natural gas market, but then there's also the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, the EMGF, which actually entails many different countries, European countries, Greece, Cyprus, and also the Palestinians, Israel. So it's a very unique forum. So it has been said that natural gas actually will create a lot of change. On the other hand, you can see that energy cooperation is the exception to the cooperative, at least economic framework between Israel and Egypt. So yes, there's the security cooperation between Israel and Egypt, which is strong and lasts for a lot of decades already. But for the economic cooperation, there's literally no trade between the two countries. And to quote the numbers for you, so in 2016, Egypt exported 0.3%, so even less than 1%, 0.3% of its total exports went to Israel, and it only imported 0.1% of its imports. So that's literally nothing. And for Israel, it was almost the same. Israel exported 0.1%, almost nothing also, to Egypt in 2016, and imported only around 1%. So the question is always, how does this paradox work? On the one hand, natural gas is supposedly the one thing that brings both sides together and bridges a divide, a political divide that has been there since the establishment of Israel, basically. And on the other hand, energy cooperation is the one exception, and it does not create any spillover. That's different spillovers than in the presentation previously. So this is like a metaphorical spillover or trickle-down effects. So what happens is you have this energy cooperation. There is natural gas being sold, imported, and exported, respectively. But then it doesn't create any change for the society. And on the other hand, it also it doesn't have any spillover effects that other areas of economy are being affected. And having said this, the interesting question is, going back to what I said earlier, will this ongoing natural gas trade, if it increases, and we can see that it increases, actually just a few days ago, Israel and Egypt signed an understanding, memorandum of understanding in Cairo. The Israeli energy Minister of Energy was there, and she signed a memorandum of understanding that actually the volume of natural gas that's being delivered from Israel to Egypt will increase, and that there's even going to be a new pipeline. So the question I'm asking myself, and I try to answer in this article to a certain extent, is that if you create more integration in the form of pipelines, and if you get used to the supply or the demand for your natural gas, will this actually lead to interdependence? Now, the problem with my research was that it depended very much on whom I asked. So if I asked the Israeli side, they would say, yes, there's a certain sense of interdependence, but it's not going to render us incapable of changing our political ways if it's necessary. And the Egyptian side said, there's no independence whatsoever. It's only an economic interest, and we're only dealing with Israel and buying their natural gas because we can export it. So that was the complication. As I see it, there is interdependence, and the Israelis say there is, and the Egyptians are very cautious and say, well, it's just an exception. We are usually not comfortable in having economic relations with Israel, but energy can remain the sole exception, but that's where it stops. There's not going to be any interdependence. Now, in order to answer that question, I went to the article by Rabinovitz and Rettig from 2018, where they actually made the point that the crude oil deal, which was a part of the 1979 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, actually meant there was no interdependence, even though it's energy-related trade. And why? Because the United States back then gave guarantees and said, if one of the two parties walks away from this deal, if it breaks, don't worry about it, we're going to be there to catch you. So Rabinovitz and Rettig, in my understanding, quite remarkably argue that, yes, there is no interdependence in such a circumstance because the whole setup of incentives and motivation changes, and they will therefore not change their political ways or have this line of trade, this one field of trade, expand into other areas of trade, because it's just a limited cooperation that is backed by a third party. Now, when you look at the natural gas deals from 2005 and 2018, they were both struck without direct guarantees by the US or a third party. So they were only economically motivated. And then naturally you would assume, okay, in this case, there must be an interdependence. But my assumption is now that Israel and Egypt are, in this case, also not directly dependent on each other. And the very simple idea behind that is that both of their national energy security, their national energy supply, is being guaranteed by the fact that they both produce natural gas, and what they export and what actually constitutes in the trade is only, so to say, the surplus. So if this should disappear, Egypt, for example, would not get Israeli natural gas. It could just not export Israeli gas, and that would be the biggest damage that's been caused. And on the Israeli side, maybe a bit more difficult, but then they would need to find a different outlet, maybe to find a different LNG facility. It's a bit more complicated, but let's say the world doesn't end for these two countries if they, from today to tomorrow, decide we will stop our cooperation. And that's exactly what's so unique in this cooperative framework, that yes, there is cooperation, and yes, it's increasing, but at the same time, it does not necessarily have any obligation, let's say, to both of the parties to stick to the deal. They could break it whenever. And then this, on a second level, this interdependence is also being mitigated. First of all, that what I just explained, the indirect interdependency. And then second of all, also through this multilateralism of the EMGF. So only the element that there's different countries also sitting around a table actually creates a very different atmosphere, which will not lead to a direct clash between Israeli and Egyptian interests in the economic sphere. And yes, there's also other fields of cooperation, which are always like the backbone. So should, and I don't see this happening, but should the natural gas trade actually disappear, there's always security coordination both countries can fall back on. And I'm almost done. I want to shortly throw out the results here. And it kind of combines what I walked you through. So first of all, we can say natural gas trade between Israel and Egypt is done for economic reasons. So it's not being backed by a political power like with the crude oil deal in '79. And it happens in spite of political perceptions. So I didn't go into detail here, but it says that, but I mean that in Egypt and in Israel, basically, the basic understanding of let's integrate our economies didn't change. They're still very cautious. They do not want that. Several different reasons, I can tell about this later. So no economic integration except for this one field, and it's economically founded. So because both sides can make money and it's a good deal, they are engaging in it. Second, political perceptions of interdependence are the reason for limiting further economic integration. So while the political perceptions are being switched off, let's say in the case of natural gas, they do definitely matter for all other fields. So political understanding of this threat of interdependence, as it were, still governs the whole cooperative framework. And the thing is that when we look at the future, it might be possible that a sort of dependence may arise because both have their energy demand covered, so it's a very comfortable situation. But in order to capture the market, and of course the Russian invasion of Ukraine actually, and the sanctions that are being imposed on Russia, and the question of energy supply for Europe actually plays into this. So Egypt and Israel together, if they work together, they can definitely capture a share of the European market, but only if they pool the resources. And the thing is, most of the interviewees I have spoken with in the walk of my PhD research actually have said, yeah, it's just an ad hoc thing. Israel and Egypt are getting together because it makes sense. 20 years from now, it might be very different. But I want to say that, and this is the fourth point I end with, that it's actually very possible to have this non-dependent, for now, non-dependent cooperative framework where both actually are making money off this combined export, but are not really dependent on each other. And this could create a future dependency because you will increase the connections of infrastructure, and Israel and Egypt will work closely together and will actually increase their cooperation in order to bring their natural gas to the European market before the rise in renewable energy resources, rise in renewable energy supply actually makes it obsolete. So very quick, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We still have something like 10 minutes, let's say. So let me quickly simply summarize from my side and then open the floor for questions. Please write the questions on or raise a hand. My comment is rather a question. Although all three presenters gave us insights from very different perspectives, very different, which included environmental consideration, market consideration, geopolitical consideration. But I think that we received some kind confusing message in a sense that Israel is both in designing its public policies, and energy policy as such hasn't been here identified as a public policy. It is rather a sphere, and energy security, energy exploitation of the resources is an area of other public policies operation, like infrastructure, economy, environmental policy, and so on. But the confusing message that I received is somehow, and I would like to learn a little bit more or understand it, maybe in the future special issues. How come on one hand Israel is so much working on competitiveness, inclusiveness of public opinion, decentralization? On the other hand, it's so much tied by these high politics consideration, and it is one of the driver of the policies related to the energy security is so much centralized, politicized. And what's the result at the very end, if there is any end? So that's from my side. Thank you very much for this absolutely inspiring presentation. I had no chance to say a few words about Carolina's and Sujata's presentation. Definitely inspiring, and then really I hope you will both decide to submit papers on presenting results of your research. So, Rafi.
I wonder, any of you, if you can answer this. Last month, a few weeks ago, the United States announced that it does not long support the proposed East Med natural gas pipeline. Does anybody knows why they oppose this?
Any other questions, comments? So, so maybe you would like to immediately react. Artur, I see you have a question. I have also a question, but I just wanted to keep myself, you know. Yeah, Artur?
Yeah, so following up with the question of Rafi, and perhaps this is the question to Stefan, is the LNG project more feasible than just the pipeline, the East Med, and also in context of the Russia invasion in Ukraine, can it be realized swiftly? So, for example, till the next winter that is coming. And the question to Katarzyna, you said that the policies Well, putting it bluntly, the policies concerning the catastrophes, environmental catastrophes, are quite far away from the other policies of Israel, as you said that Israel is trying to avoid decisions in this field, and we can see more of the swift, decisive policies in other fields conducted by the government of Israel. And you said also that Israel is more engaged in the international framework, not reclusive. And once again, in many occasions in different policies, you can see this focus on autonomy in international field and not being dependent on the others. So why this policy seems to be so different from the other policies of Israel, other public policies? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe Sujata, would you like to start? And you have to unmute yourself. Sujata, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. So about the East Med pipeline, one reason that it's no longer receiving support of the US and other countries is because when it was conceived, people thought that there was more gas in the East Mediterranean, although there is, but there hasn't been a hit in the Eastern Mediterranean area, Israeli Eastern Mediterranean area in the past 8 or 9 years. There has been no hit. After 2013, no gas has been discovered in the Eastern Mediterranean economic waters of Israel. Now, the one partner that needs to be into the East Med pipeline is Egypt, because it has a lot of gas in Zohar field and other fields in the northern Egypt. But Egypt does not want to be part of the East Mediterranean pipeline project because it has 2 LNG terminals in Idku and Damietta. Now, these 2 terminals had been lying idle for the past 4 or 5 years after the Arab Spring. So Egypt obviously wants to use these 2 terminals to the optimum, and does not want to spare any gas for the pipeline. These are 2 reasons that that the East Med pipeline no longer has the support that it had say 4 or 5 years ago. But even then, it is such a difficult project because it goes, although technically feasible, but it involves now the cost of gas is going up, but about 2 years ago, the cost of gas had gone down to absolute about $4 per let's say the cost of gas was so low that the East Med company, you need purchasing agreements before you actually invest into large projects. You need purchasing agreements with the buyers. So there were no purchasing agreement. Plus the cost was so high, although feasible, technically feasible, the cost of East Med project was very high. To add to it, now there isn't adequate gas in the region to be exported through such an expensive pipeline or a pipeline, and Egypt does not want to be part of this gas pipeline project and make its LNG projects in Idku and Damietta as redundant. So there are several issues involved, and no one now sees a resolution to each of these issues, which would make the pipeline a viable project.
Thank you very much, Carolina.
Thank you for this question. I think, this is a very, very small policy about a very, very small fragment of reality. But somehow I see some patterns that are similar in this policy to bigger questions, like a question of Haredi draft, or maybe state-religion relations, Palestinian question, other questions in which you have these endless committees, court judgments, discussions, various NGOs lobbying for things to go in different directions. And the politicians in the middle of it, with their really manifold constraints on them, that they decide not to decide year by year by year. And here it's a bit similar, because you have these economic issues and environmental issues and lobbying groups, and a company which is in many ways beyond the law, because of its secrecy, because of the international dealings that are the basis of the existence and of operations of this company. So in the end, you have this decision that really says, let's leave it to the Ministry of Environmental Protection and their administrative decisions. Let's not decide once and for all that we go against this deal. And actually, after the war in Ukraine broke, I see maybe there is some wisdom in it, in the way that they are still open to having imports of oil from Emirates instead of from Russia, if things turn really ugly. So there is a way which might really seem to be undemocratic, but because things are really securitized, and this is an area in which public opinion rallied around the topic only recently. So maybe this is really also fresh in terms of the reflection of the political elites on that.
Yeah, I might want to add about the EastMed. I hope it's not coming, because in my opinion, it would basically damage the regional cooperation that is still very fledgling. So even beyond the environmental considerations and the cost calculations, the project doesn't make sense, because then Israel might, for example, say, oh, it's much too complicated to sell our gas to Egypt, and they're not paying so well. We'll just sell it to Europe straight away through the pipeline. And it might basically disrupt this market that is just coming into existence. I don't think the EastMed is a good idea. It might come back to the discussion now after Europe needs a huge amount of natural gas and oil. Although the LNG facilities in Egypt are definitely ready and can be filled to a much higher extent. I think this year was announced by Al-Mullah, the Egyptian Minister of Energy. He said they want to have 5 times as much natural gas in these facilities than the year before, which actually is the outcome of a longer development. So first of all, we're going to see that Israel is going to go up from 3.5 to 5.5 BCM, which comes through the Gulf of Eilat. So it's actually what is going through Jordan is now being to some extent diverted to Egypt. And then there's a second pipeline being built. I already mentioned that that's going to take 2 to 4 years, something like that. But definitely the amount is going up. Egypt themselves are also getting more natural gas out of the ground right now. So the capabilities in LNG export from Egypt are much greater this year than they have ever been before. So I think the considerations for pipeline will also become obsolete, because you will have, in my opinion, cheaper LNG, much more readily available. It can go everywhere. It's not constrained to where the pipelines lead. And very quickly on Joanna's question about public policy and democratic overview, basically, at least speaking about the natural gas deals with Egypt, that's very much an elite project. So yes, Israel is a democracy. So back home, everyone discusses how we should take out the gas from the sea and to what extent should we use it and sell it and keep it for ourselves. After that has been done, and there is a certain share that the government can take and sell, that's what they do. And in the case of Egypt, this is done through a lot of times through private companies on the one hand, and then on the other hand, also through the intelligence services of Egypt. So this is a very covert way, let's say, of a democracy to make deals. But it's a matter of national security. That's what Israel would say. So it's securitized, and no one should ask questions if it helps the national goal of having better relations with Egypt and actually making some money off the oil that's being sold this way.
Thank you very much. I know we are run out of time, but I can't refuse our listener and participant of the seminar, Zhang Xuan. I hope that I pronounce your name correctly, who asked a question, and briefly, anyone who can really give a really brief comment on it. Zhang asked, will it be possible for Turkey to become part of the East Mediterranean gas cooperation? Basically, about engaging Turkey, having in mind that there is a Cyprus and Greece already engaged. Stefan.
Can I start in one sentence, basically? I think it's possible because there's a lot of change between Israel and Turkey. So maybe in the long run, and now that Turkey has is having diminishing backup from Russia, let's say, so maybe Turkey needs to come into the fold. The only problem is Greece and Cyprus. So if this can be solved, then yes, I see a future for Turkey in the regional market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to finish, though I feel, and I am actually convinced that there is much more to say on these very important issues and topics. However, we need to continue, and let's have a break. If Artur, I would like to kindly ask you to have 10 minutes break, and then we will, with delay, start the final panel. Thank you very much.
See you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present some of my research on the diversity policy trap in Israeli higher education. The American scholar Peter Schuck writes, the diversity in America is in the pantheon of unquestioned goods. Diversity is right up there with progress, motherhood, and apple pie. In my research, I found that the reality in Israel is quite different, described by many as a war on home, or as walking on eggshells, or as I choose to call it, a diversity trap. The 2018 national law inspired me to think about diversity policy in light of the Israeli reality of unequal citizenship. Grossman, a famous Israeli author, wrote, "Equality is not a prize a citizen gets from his or her state for doing something, not even for sacrificing life for the country. Haredim, who refuse to serve in the military, are also citizens with equal rights. Equality is a starting point of citizenship and not an outcome. It's the ground from which citizenship stems. It's also what enables the liberty to be different and yet equal to any other person." The criticism captures the heart of the diversity policy trap. Though equality is a goal, it is promoted through unequal mechanisms reflecting a stratified Israeli citizenship. So who are we talking about when we're talking about diversity policies? The current policy effort focuses on three groups. On Arabs, the policy names Arabs, Jews, and Chalkessians, Haredim, or ultra-Orthodox Jews, and Israeli Jews of Ethiopian descent. These groups are all underrepresented in all levels of higher education, all have high rates of first generation to higher education, and all struggle with this diversity trap from different directions. The Haredim and the Arabs challenge diversity efforts both on a practical and ideological level. Both mismatch the student prototype current Israeli institutions are set for in terms of core knowledge, language, age, and more. Both also mismatch the Jewish democratic ethos that the institutions are aligned with. Jews of Ethiopian descent suffer from a mismatch as well, the one that as members of the Zionist collective is more difficult to rationalize and therefore to translate into substantive value of interventions. Over the past decade, though the government has invested more than ever, both on access and partnership in higher education, the policy put in place presents us with a paradox to equality. In the research, I tried to understand why this happens. This presentation will focus on the policy narratives of each program, and specifically on the policy drivers which help explain the policy trap. The theoretical framework builds on Shafir and Peled's conceptualization of multiple citizenship regime, ethno-nationalism, democratic liberalism, and civic republicanism. This regime explains how different citizenship discourses frame policy approaches for different population groups. Within higher education, diversity policies are usually discussed through the tension between meritocracy and equal opportunities approaches, highlighting economic versus social policy logics. The research uses the multiple citizenship regime and the meritocracy opportunity tension while analyzing the policy narrative through four logics: economic, social, civic, and national. Student diversity policies in Israel served as the case study, with 4 examined policy sites: the national policy and 3 institutions, a university, a public college, and a private college. Findings show that in the last decade, the policies are group-based. In line with the field, I present the findings through the group classification. The data included 75 national policy documents and 54 semi-structured interviews with policymakers and implementers from each of the policy sites, which were analyzed using a critical discourse methodology. So as I said, the findings reflect the stratified Israeli citizenship. It includes the diversity model includes a universal dimension in which the right to higher education is promised to all citizens and is joined by group-based support programs where citizenship discourse frames explain simultaneously inclusive and exclusive practices. The overall universal policy is often framed as widening participation more than diversity. It's described as holding economic value to development and growth for individuals, institutions, and the entire market, social value for mobility and for reducing disparities, and civic value for socialization and as an incentive for civic engagement. Whereas the overall policy may seem a bit like the American apple pie, the group-based programs tell us a totally different story. So I'm going to start with the support for Arab students. The support for Arab students began in 2002 with relatively small budgets. In 2008 and 2009, as Israel was preparing to join the OECD, the Arab population was identified as the economic development and growth engine, with higher education as an important step on the way to employment. In 2010-11, in line with the development and growth agenda, the Council for Higher Education increased the budgets for this population and defined widening participation as a key goal. In 2013-14, the plan was fully implemented in all public institutions. And in 2016-17, 2 sub-programs were launched for Bedouins in the Negev and for the non-citizen residents of East Jerusalem. The policy drivers reflect the wider tension between socioeconomic inclusion for Arabs and national exclusion. Social policy drivers have been relatively stable since 2002 and framed the policy in terms of mobility. Economic drivers new to the current policy were central in opening a policy window where economic needs of the state, the institutions, and the populations converged. An interviewee from the public college shared, this model of diversity and inclusion is largely a result of reality, of economic conditions, yes? I mean, the secular Jewish students are gone, so there is need to turn to the religious, the Haredim, and the Arabs. I don't fool myself to think that the most right-wing government in Israeli history has become pro-Arabs, yes? Still, they invest quite a bit of money in making higher education accessible to Arabs. In this quote, she illuminates the paradox in which a right-wing government that excludes Arabs politically and legally also acts to include them economically. Ethno-national drivers were blurred in the socio-economic narrative, but did come up as criticism of its hidden layers. An Arab interviewee shared how a critical lens of the name of the program reveals hidden exclusion mechanisms. The name of the Arab, Bedouin, Cherkessian populations are the entire story. This sentence, this program, its title, summarizes the entire story. Divide and rule. This is the Arab political story. Next, we'll be funding proposals for Muslims, Christians, Cherkessians, Bedouins. The divide and rule discourse frame, she claims, enables economic inclusion while attempting to reduce national threat. The ethno-national threat was especially apparent in policy documents and interviews referring to East Jerusalem residents and to the Bedouins of the Negev. One of the interviewees shared, being socially responsible, you say, I prefer that these young people do not go to study in the territories and do not go to study abroad in Arab countries so that they do not become more extreme. I can accept that. Honestly, sometimes this statement is a little difficult for me. but I do understand it, and I do not want to close my eyes and say one is not related to another. Yes, they are related. A parallel between security and economic costs helped frame the benefit of economic investment in a group that is not part of the nation. In this case, economic partnership was claimed to be valuable for civic partnership and for reducing of national hostility. This helps explain the policy trap where economic drivers promoted inclusion within the exclusive borders of the Jewish state. And moving on to the Haredim. Policy for this group developed in two stages. First, community entrepreneurs requested that the state and institutions open tracks for Haredim only, requests that were met with gradual opening of a college in Bnei Brak, in Jerusalem, and in the Ono Academic Center. In 2009, as part of Israel joining the OECD, the Haredi community, similar to the Arab community, was identified as an economic engine for development and growth. In 2010 and 11, the Council for Higher Education initiated a multi-year program for this community as part of this development.
Excuse me, Ayala, I believe there is some problem with the microphone of yours. I don't know if there is something to be done now about it, and we can hear most, like 95% of what you are saying, but there are some works in the background.
What I can do, I can try to connect from another phone. Is this that? Did you not hear the entire presentation?
No. We heard most
now
of
it's
it.
fine.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So in the center of this slide, you see Supreme Court Justice Aaron Barak, or former Supreme Court Justice Aaron Barak, lecturing to Haredi law students in a gender-segregated hall. This picture reflects the policy trap. It is allowing segregated education a way to increase educational opportunities, or does it reduce opportunities while legitimizing discrimination? Okay, economy was the main policy driver. However, unlike the Arab case, economy did not converge with society and citizenship, but rather served as a checks and balances mechanism, promoting equality while legitimizing discrimination. The document presenting the program stated, integration of Haredim in higher education is a clear interest of the state. The Council for Higher Education and Public Budgeting Committee are responsible for finding the means to implement it. Higher education has become a basic condition for integrating and success in the workforce. And many fields in the modern economy are blocked for those without higher education. The low participation of Haredim in the workforce not only harms them their personal economic status, it also slows down market economic progress as a whole. The convergence of Haredi and market interests was utilized to divert that attention from the social and civic implications of inequality, of recognizing group segregation. The policy was framed as multicultural and presented as a way to gain trust and legitimacy of the Haredi population. A Haredi interviewee explained the need to isolate the economic driver from any potential civic educational driver. The higher education system in Israel, unlike the world, is the best system to give a person professional knowledge. So that's its role. The higher education system is perceived as an education place. As seen in the statement, I have values which I'm unwilling to give up. So you are dealing with education. You want to instill values, not just knowledge. So if you're an educator who instills values, let me educate myself. Let me educate the way I am, the way my values are. You will not dictate values to me. The distinction between education and professional training serves to include Haredim in higher education while excluding them, supposedly by choice, from core civic education. In the name of economic drivers, institutions were redesigned not only with group and gender segregation, but also with separation between the professional and the civic educational missions. In this case, the policy trap is explained by economic drivers promoting inclusion alongside multicultural reasoning legitimizing exclusion. Okay, last are the Jews of Ethiopian descent that, unlike other groups, have always gotten support within higher education. Historically, the support was granted through the Ministry of Immigration and Absorption. In 2017, as part of the national policy update, recognizing that this community is no longer an immigrant community, responsibility was moved from the Ministry of Immigration and Absorption to each of the other relevant ministries, and the Council for Higher Education assumed responsibility for students of Ethiopian descent. The need for an update reflected a long-term policy track, where the government is committed to equal opportunities of this population, though exhibiting this commitment through labeling and discriminating mechanisms, where eligibility for services is granted through immigration and absorption policy. Policy drivers, the policy drivers were mostly political, government responding to community demands to stop segregated support, and higher education responding to the government decision. This program challenged the overall economic diversity policy narrative, given the small population with marginal economic significance. An interviewee from the Council for Higher Education said, "In a reality of limited energy, the decision was made to invest energy where market influence would be greatest. Therefore, Jews of Ethiopian descent were not included. They're too small of a community." Whereas economic logic served as an inclusion mechanism for Arabs and Haredim, here it was actually an exclusion mechanism. Two interviewees suggested looking at alternative costs to higher education in order to justify the need for the intervention. One said, "There is interest in advancing the population because otherwise, once again, I'm talking about the crime rates among the Ethiopian population and among the youth. It's much higher than the rate in the population." And one of the things that we know is that there is a strong link between education and crime. The more educated and academic you are, you're less of a criminal. In this quote, a cost-benefit equation is used to justify investment in higher education. In another case, a community leader spoke up in the Knesset meeting discussing moving services to the council. Our potential is very well realized in war, but not in the home front. And that's just annoying. Here, too, it was said that discrimination is everywhere. We need to understand where discrimination stems from. There is the Ministry of Absorption and the Council for Higher Education, which is the expert on academia. So why not move the responsibility for the policy there? We have been waiting years and years. Use the economic discourse frame of realizing the potential while comparing between the state realizing the military potential, but not doing so regarding academic potential. In this case, the racism flag served to speed the transition and to design a new program, closing disparities and banning labeling and exclusion. Here, the policy trap is explained by social and civic inclusion alongside economic and racial exclusion mechanisms. I'm going to summarize the findings. The research shows that the economy serves to include Arabs and Haredim, though exclude Ethiopians. The social logic justified inclusion of the three groups, though was weak in actually advancing the policy. Citizenship and nationalism had varying impacts on each population. In the Arab case, economy helped bridge between the strength of civic logic and the weakness of national logic, and led to an integrative policy mechanism. In the Haredi case, economy reduced the significance of civic and national isolation and legitimized a segregated policy mechanism. Last, in the Ethiopian case, the policy could not be oblivious to the claim for racism in the case of a group characterized by civic and national belonging, engagement, and contribution. This led to an inclusive policy mechanism. This is my final slide. Going back to the theoretical framework, I suggest defining the Israeli diversity model as threefold. where the distinction between the universal policy dimension and other two dimensions contribute to understanding of the policy trap. As the dimensions meet, neoliberal economic influence help create opportunities for including previously excluded groups and for enhancing socioeconomic equality. Civic and national characteristics were blurred in the policy narrative, while using the overlap between socioeconomic and ethno-national stratification in order to discuss the policy in universal socioeconomic terms. However, the research shows that, that this does not indicate weakness of citizenship and nationalism. Blurring these logics helped preserve a neoliberal agenda and distract from potential clashes with citizenship and nationalism precisely because of their strength. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayala. And soon we will have also some time for the discussions about this very interesting paper. And we have now ahead of us another presentation from Raphael, Israel's view on the state of Palestine's capacity to bring cases to international courts. So a bit difference here, but still talking about the national identities. The floor is yours, Raphael.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me correctly? Because
yes,
I've had some problems with my with my device. I had to fix it. So okay, now I will share the screen. Just a moment. Now, can you see the presentation?
I see the blank page now. Okay, it's there.
Yes, it's there. Okay. Okay, so the title is Israel's view on the state of Palestine's capacity to bring cases to international courts. And this is part of a research I make as I prepare a book on the development of the Palestinian statehood. And as you know, the views vary as to whether there is a Palestinian state or not. Some claim it is, some claim that there is no such a state. And in fact, some force or even much force is in the arguments of both sides. So I believe we must make reference to the international community of states, because there is no international institution, no international organ that may state with a binding force for the entire international community that there is a Palestinian state. So we must make reference to member states of the international community as a supreme legislator in international law. And this is precisely a small part of this work that has to be done. It is a view of the state of Israel on whether or not Palestine is a state and whether or not, being a state, it can bring cases to international courts. And to begin with, please tell me whether the slides go on. Did it change? It's okay. I hope so. So after the abortive attempt to accede to the United Nations as a full member, Palestine decided to apply for a non-member observer state position, and in fact it was granted such a status in the UN by resolution 67/19 of November 2012. And what was the result of this? First of all, this made it possible for Palestine to accede to some international treaties, those to which the United Nations Secretary General acts as depository, on the basis of the all states formula. This is formula which says that all states may be parties to particular treaty without further specification. What kind of states? What kind of state should it be? And on the basis of this all states formula, in Palestine acceded to many international treaties to which UN Secretary General acts as depositary, including the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. As you can see, Article 125, Section 3 states that this statute shall be open to accession by all states. So this is precisely the all states formula. On the other hand, Palestine deposited a declaration by which it accepted the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice on the basis of both relevant article of the statute of the court, as well as the Security Council resolution, which define the conditions which must be met in order to allow a state which is not a party to the statute to bring cases before international courts. And in fact, And in effect, the State of Palestine instituted two proceedings before both courts. First, it's a proceedings before International Court of Justice, where the State of Palestine asked to settle the dispute with the United States over the relocation of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And second case was brought before the International Criminal Court against Israel this time, over the alleged crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territories. And in fact, upon receipt of a valid declaration by the State of Palestine in this second case, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court opened a preliminary examination whether or not the requirements of the Rome Statute were met by the State of Palestine. And eventually in 2019, it announced that in fact, Palestine met those criteria, but owing to some complex legal and factual issues that surrounded the case, it decided to ask the pretrial chamber of the court on the territorial extension of the court's jurisdiction. And on this occasion, Israel issued some official statements regarding Palestine's capacity to bring cases to international courts. As it is not a party to the proceedings before the International Court of Justice, it seems that no official statement was issued. I addressed the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but I didn't get any response. But it stands to reason for me that no official standpoint has been adopted, because the State of Israel is not a party to these proceedings. It won't be affected in any way, but by a potential decision that may be made by the court. The case is still at its preliminary, I may say, preliminary stage. So this is reasonable. Yes, the State of Israel failed to make an official statement on this point, but the situation is different with regard to the proceedings before the International Criminal Court, because Israel was sued before this court. And to begin with, this is Article 12 of the Rome Statute. And what is of interest for us is this section 2.a. It says that the court may exercise its jurisdiction if one or more of the following states are party to the statute, and the state on the territory of which the conduct is in question occurred, and the state of which the person accused of the crime is a national. So there are two bases of jurisdiction, territorial and national. And we will be concerned with this one. And in fact, Israel issued two quite similar memoranda. One was authored by Minister of Foreign Affairs. It's much shorter. And second one, longer, was prepared by the Office of the Attorney General. Both documents bear the same title, the International Criminal Court's lack of jurisdiction over the so-called situation in Palestine, but also the Israeli notification of January 2015 regarding Palestine accession to the Rome Statute is also important. And here you may see the scan of this notification. Especially section 2 and 3 is relevant. You may see for the state of Israel, Palestine does not satisfy the criteria for statehood under international law and lacks the legal capacity to join the aforesaid statute. And in section 3, Israel regards accession of Palestine to the Rome Statute as without any legal validity or effect. According to the State of Israel, the jurisdictional basis of territoriality and nationality established that the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction relies on the fact that sovereign state delegates its criminal jurisdiction over its own territory and nationals to the court. Accordingly, the court's jurisdiction requires that there must be a sovereign state in the meaning of international law. Next, the state must possess jurisdiction to be delegated. And thirdly, in fact, the delegation of jurisdiction must have taken place already. And in Israel's view, none of these requirements were met. And the main argument was that Palestine was not a sovereign state under international law. In international law, there is in fact no definition of a state. We may describe a state, but it is difficult to define it. But certainly there must be a population, a stable, settled population. There must be a territory. It is not necessary that there are precisely established borders, but the territory claimed and in fact possessed by a state is of course indispensable. And then an effective government which acts independently. It is sometimes said that independent government is limited only by international law. And according to Israel, which called Palestine the Palestinian entity, not the state of Palestine, does not meet the criteria of a sovereign state. And what are the main arguments? First argument, Palestine does not exercise sovereignty and effective control over the territory it claims. That is the West Bank, the Gaza Strip with East Jerusalem. And according to the Israeli view, the sovereignty over those territories is still in abeyance, and it must be settled during the Israeli-Palestinian permanent status negotiations. Second of the main arguments is that the fact that a number of states have recognized the state of Palestine does not make Palestine a state. Why? Because in the Israeli opinion, acts of recognition of a state are not constitutive, are simply declaratory of existing situation, existing statehood. So recognitions cannot create a state if it doesn't exist according to objective international criteria. And then according to Israel, in many cases where the recognitions in fact took place, those acts of recognition were nothing more but simply declarations of sympathy for aspirations of the Palestinian people and merely referred to a Palestinian state as a matter of future, so as a state yet to be created during the Israeli-Palestinian permanent status negotiations. So according to Israel, as Palestine is not a state, then it has no territory under its sovereign control. And if it has no territory under its sovereign control, then it cannot delegate criminal jurisdiction over its territory, over nationals, according to the well-known Roman principle that no one can transfer more rights than he owns himself. And as Palestine does not fulfill all the objective criteria of statehood, according to Israel, this deficiency cannot be cured simply by Palestine's accession to the Rome Statute. Why? Because on one hand, according to Israel, accession is a purely procedural or formal act, and it is simply a circulating of an instrument of accession to the Secretary General, who acts as depository and who simply accepts, receives and accepts this instrument of accession. Next, determination of statehood, yes, which is a matter of substance to be judged according to objective criteria and objective principles of international law, cannot be simply bypassed by mere reference to a matter of procedure or to points of procedure. The State of Israel, in its official statements, also made reference to the General Assembly Resolution 67/19, which endows the State of Palestine with the observer state status. And the Israeli government says that this resolution cannot form the basis for acceptance of instrument of accession in this case, because it simply did not settle the question of Palestinian statehood. First of all, and this is of course true, the General Assembly resolutions are not binding. Then resolutions cannot be regarded as constitutive with respect to statehood. And then the Israeli government pointed to the fact that many states which supported the resolution, in fact, did not regard Palestine as a state, but simply treated Palestinian statehood as a matter of future. Alternatively, even assuming that also non-sovereign entities have capacity to bring cases before the International Criminal Court, and this is the view with which the government of Israel did not agree, but assuming for the sake of argumentation that this is correct, even then, Palestine has no jurisdiction over the areas under the control of the Palestinian Authority, and over Jerusalem. So again, it could not delegate to the International Criminal Court the competence that it simply did not have. So, in conclusion, the position of the Israeli government is that Palestine is not competent to bring cases to the International Criminal Court, and the main argument is that it does not meet the objective criteria of statehood under international law. In particular, it has no sovereignty over territory. So having no sovereignty over territory cannot delegate its jurisdiction to International Criminal Court. In fact, it must be said that the decision of the pre-trial chamber was given in February 2021, and the pre-trial chamber decided by majority of votes, 2-1 to be precise, that the court had territorial jurisdiction in the situation of Palestine case, and this jurisdiction extended to Gaza Strip, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. So the case is still evolving, but an important point is to be made. The court did not settle the question of Palestinian statehood. It was not competent to do so, but it decided that precisely for the purposes of the Rome Statute, Palestine fulfilled all the criteria. So for that purpose, Palestine was regarded by majority of the court as a state. And what about the case before the International Court of Justice? One may assume that Israel's standpoint would be similar. Palestine has not fulfilled the requirements of statehood, so it cannot be a party to the proceedings in the International Court of Justice. But as I said, this is the assumption. It stands to reasons for me, but it is an assumption. Israel is not a party in this proceeding, so perhaps this is the reason why it is quiet on the point. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the interesting paper and for keeping up with time. And we don't have the third speaker as far as I'm concerned. So we are moving to the discussion session. And once again, we are free to ask questions in the Q&A, in the chat box. And if there is somebody from the panelists that would like to ask the question, and I see that we have the first question. And once again, Raphael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, Ayala. If the Haredi population are willing to allow their women to study, but they make the provision that they want them to study separately from men, and suppose that the women receive exactly the same education as men from the same teachers, there's no discrimination there. They just don't mix between men and women. Is this still discrimination in your eyes? Or it doesn't simply, or the situation that I described now never happens because they get lower sort of education, they get lower quality teachers, then they don't get any teachers who are men. So what I described, this scenario is hypothetical and cannot exist. I wonder if you can comment on two of these questions, please.
Thank you. First of all, it is a lot of hypotheticals, okay? Because in fact, there is separation, and the programs that are open for men are not the exact same programs that are open for women. Okay, so we have tracking different genders to different professions. That's one discrimination. The second discrimination is that women are not allowed to teach in men's programs, but men are allowed to teach in women's programs. So there's discrimination in employment against women. There is a famous or a very quoted research of Neta Barak Cohen from the law school at Hebrew U that discusses 3 levels of discrimination. I can't remember the third one now, but those would be the de facto discriminations. In my research, I'm presenting the narrative as it's told by the policy documents and by the policy makers. So the narrative talks about separation as recognition, which is a little different than what we see with other populations. I think the most interesting comparison is to Ethiopians. I couldn't go into this in the presentation, but the policy for Ethiopians does not allow institutions to give support to more than 2 students at a time, so that there's not group segregation. And it's interesting to see the 2 extremes where for one group, you must give support only on an individual basis. And for the other group, the assumption is that the support, the entire program is segregated.
Okay, so there is a space also for my questions. So first, maybe to Ayala, how do you see the new government as more the opportunities to these more inclusive policies? Because on the one hand, we have the first government in a long time that doesn't have the Haredi party. So is it something that can move forward with more progressive, I don't know, curriculum to the Haredim, or is it just more of alienation of this group? And on the other hand, obviously, we have the first autonomous Arab party that is supporting the government, that is part of the government, and we have quotations from Mansour Abbas about the Jewishness of Israeli state as something obvious. So how do you see it? And the second question, maybe I will already pointed to Raphael. Is there a official legal status of a government in exile in the international law, and is it applied to this case in, I don't know, the narrative of the Palestinians or in international organizations, also other parties, because probably no, not Israel. Yeah, so is it there something like legal status of the government in exile that we know from the history of Poland? Because if UN and many states consider the Palestinian territories are occupied, so maybe this is the loophole for also the statehood of the Palestine in their eyes.
I go first.
Okay, so Ayala, okay.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I will say that the diversity policy in higher education started a decade ago. The Council for Higher Education works through multiple year plans. So we've already gone through 2 multiple year plans, and the Council is working right now on a new plan that will start next year and will last for another 6 years. In terms of the numbers, I showed you the graph. We see a nice increase in participation of all groups. I think that at this point, the policy is designed more by the council and by the institutions than by the government. The government is still committed to allocating budgets. The program for Haredim has been in many discussions in the court and has finally come to a resolution about 6 months ago. So yes, I think the policy is going to go in a more inclusive patterns. Does that have to do with the composition of the government? I'm not sure. I think that the interesting thing is that these policies started when it wasn't the obvious government for such policies. At this point, there's clear commitment to diversity. The more diverse the institutions are, new challenges are arising, challenges that are leaving more room to discussing citizenship, nationalism, belonging, identity. And I believe and hope that we will see more responses on a policy level to some of those questions or new challenges in the new multi-year plan.
Okay, maybe just a quick follow-up question. So you don't see any, I don't know, pressure trying to influence from the Ra'am party, from the Mansour Abbas to, I don't know, frame this new curriculum in a new way for the Arabs?
No, so I will say that from the beginning, the access for the Arabs was promoted by Arab academics and was way less in conversation in the Knesset or in the government. It's interesting how there's different dynamics for each of the programs. Actually, the program for the Ethiopian Jews is the one that came the most from the government and the Knesset, with activists from the community bringing the topic up in the Knesset and eventually having a government decision that influenced the transition of the policy from the Ministry of Immigration and Absorption to the Council for Higher Education. The program for Haredim is very much discussed in the courts. So it's interesting to see how we have one program in the courts, one in the parliament, and one totally inside academia.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so as to the government in the exile, it is in fact partly regulated by international customary law, and it follows from this fact that international law currently does not allow to acquire territory through the use of force. Similarly, it is impossible by the use of force to incorporate a state to another state. And then when such a situation happens, in fact, then such a government in exile works, and it is a reflection of the conviction that this is still the right government of the state in question and not the puppet government which was established by the aggressor. So this is the main rationale which stands behind the governments in exile. And now as to the Palestinian authorities or the Palestinian government, it is my opinion that internationally, the Palestinian governments works much more effectively than inside the Palestinian territory. It managed to obtain this observer status in the United Nations. It managed to gain recognition as a state from more than 100 states, members of the international community. It has embassies, yes, it has diplomatic relations. So it works very effectively internationally, much more effectively than inside Palestine where it is limited by Israeli authorities. So I think there is no need for a Palestinian government in exile. It works correctly, I think, but it is limited inside Palestine by Israeli authorities, by Israeli government. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much. Raphael, you want to add something?
Yeah, two questions, one for Ayelet and one for Raphael. Ayala, sorry, I confused your name. So what do you suggest as a way forward? Should we insist on our liberal way that we are not going to compromise and we want it our way, and if we don't have it, then the women will stay at home? Or we should find any compromise between our liberal view and the Haredi view? And if there is a compromise, what is it? If you can tell us, because I presume, I don't know you, but just a presumption. I'm sorry if it's incorrect. I presume that you would like to open up education for women, and I can testify that that's my ambition too. So I just wonder between what is the lesser evil, how we can go forward. And for Raphael, may I suggest, when you want to move forward for publication, I think it can be a good exercise to see what Israel says vis-a-vis what the 138 countries that do recognize Palestine say on each and every argumentation that you put forward, and to see the disagreements between the two sides. And maybe you can also tell us what you think. I mean, because you're quite silent in your presentation, and I want you to have a voice. I'm interested to hear what you want to. Actually, you agree with this argumentation? You disagree with the argumentation? If you agree, why? If you disagree, why? So if you do this kind of a mix between what the 138 countries say and what Israel say, and then you can voice opinion where you stand, I think it will be very, very interesting paper.
Okay, I was silent about the issue because I gave voice to Israeli government. It was my purpose. Also, the time limits made me to make this decision. But according to me, of course, sorry, it's like a lawyer's talking, but in fact, there are arguments pro and con. But according to me, it is much more convincing that, in fact, Palestine meets the criteria of statehood. It has population, this is beyond question. It has territory. Of course, we may argue what the territory is, yes, what are the precise boundaries of this territory, but it is, in fact, for a state to exist, precisely defined territory, precisely defined borders are not fully relevant. It is enough that there is a core territory which is undisputedly under the jurisdiction of a state. This is enough. There is a government. As I said, this government, in fact, has a capacity to act effectively, because this effectiveness is very important. It acts very effectively. And the Palestinian government's activity in the international sphere, in the international arena, clearly proves this. They have problems inside Palestine, yes, but outside on the international arena, they act very effectively. They managed to become recognized, yes, by more than 100 states. They have this non-observer state status in the UN. Also, it is another proof which I may suggest is that the principle of self-determination is one of the most important principles of international law. It is so-called jus cogens. It cannot be departed from. Like, you may depart from virtually any rule principle of international law in bilateral relations, but you cannot depart from jus cogens, and this is precisely one of the jus cogens. So it also may be treated, the application of the principle of self-determination may be regarded as curing some deficiencies of the state, which, let's say, like Palestine, cannot act fully independently because it is controlled at the end of the day by another power. In this case, it is Israel. And in fact, in the history after 1945, there were states like Democratic Republic of Congo, which really did not deserve to be called state because they simply had no government. But owing to this principle of self-determination, they were recognized as states, despite the deficiencies. And yet, on the other hand, we cannot say that Palestinian statehood needs to be decided during permanent status negotiations. Those negotiations last for, 30 years, yes, and there is no prospect of finishing them. So we cannot all the time rely on the fact that the Palestinian statehood needs to be decided, yes. Those treaties of the 1990s, the Oslo Accords, etc., cannot be interpreted in that way, because they cannot be interpreted in a way to prevent realization of Palestinian statehood. Yes. So I think there is much more evidence suggesting that there is a Palestinian state. Of course, we may contest this. Yes, there are problems. This is obvious. But if I were to make a 0-1 decision, I would say yes, Palestine is a state.
And sorry, can I just follow up just to clarify? When you say Palestine, what do you mean? Do you mean West Bank and Gaza?
Mm-hmm.
But there's no connection between the two, and there's no sovereignty of the PA on Gaza.
Yes, but there is control, effective control over at least the A area. Yes, I think. And
not by the PA.
By
a different government, not by the PA.
But by the government of Palestine. Yes.
No. There's no government of Palestine. There's government in West Bank and there's Hamas in Gaza.
Yes, it is recognized by the United Nations. The government, Palestinian authorities are called the government of Palestine, of the state of Palestine.
No control on Gaza.
No,
doesn't have any control.
Yes, but okay, but it is enough for a government to control a part of territory in international law. Yes, so, and as I said, yes, I agree. There are problems. There are problems inside Palestine. Yes, but you cannot deprive a people of exercise of the principle of self-determination, simply saying that they do not control fully their territory.
There was a question on the chat whether monopoly on power is one of the requirements of sovereignty. Is it?
Not necessary. There are also examples like Cyprus. When it was created in 1960, it was decided that it must keep its territorial integrity. Similarly, some 30 years earlier, when Austria was created, it was also decided and stipulated in a treaty that it could not give up its territory, its independence. So such constraints are possible, yes. It is not decisive fully. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think that you will need to clarify this in your paper, because they're not the same. They are very, very different, Gaza and the West Bank.
Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. But it doesn't suffice to deprive them of statehood. This is my opinion.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very interesting debate at the end of our seminar, and we are moving to the closing remarks. And before I will pass the voice.
Lau wants to say something, I think.
Oh, if you want me to answer your question, depending on the time.
I'm waiting patiently.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yes,
so yes, of course, I'd like to see everyone in higher education, women and men. and the court is ruling on what the right way to do so is. I think that this is why I call it a trap. If we didn't have any economic restraints, I would like to see every single program that's open in a general campus open for Haredim as well, and open for men and for women. Today, that's not the case. Doubly, okay? First of all, not all programs that are open to the general population exist in a Haredi only capacity, and for sure not for men and for women. So I think this would be one major step in the way. At the same time, if I can spin off from your question a little bit, I think that one of the main challenges is one of the challenges for the next multi-year plan is to see how the council and the institutions retake responsibility for a more equal, more equitable policy for all. I think that right now the reality is that we see a lot of negotiation between communities and the council and the institutions. And some have more of a bargaining power than others. I think that an equitable policy would see what are some of the questions that came up, among them separation, okay? And if we think that separation is in fact a form of recognition, let's reopen the conversation about Arab campus in Israel, okay? Let's reopen some of the other conversations. And if we're against that, we should be against with all. I gave the example of support for Ethiopians, that has to be individual. Arabs can have groups support as well within integrated campuses, and Haredim can have totally segregated campuses. I think that the policymakers need to start looking in this direction, and not only in this direction, not only at the populations. Ask, is there really a justification for the different policy design for different groups? In some cases, there is. There is a justification for language support, or for Arabs, or for English and math for Haredim. There are some things that don't necessarily have justifications. We see that scholarships, that there's different conditions for scholarships for the different populations. We see that support in employment, moving on from higher education to employment, looks different for the different populations. I'm not sure that that's equitable and that that's just.
Thank you once again, and once again, apologies to Ayala. And now, to be on the safe side, I will just ask if anybody has anything to add or ask to the discussion. And if not, I would like to really thank all of you, and it was a pleasure working with you on the way to the event, organizing the seminar. And your fresh approach was really something interesting to me, and will add to my research, obviously. And hopefully we will see each other on some events, maybe in Israel, in Bar Ilan, at the conference of AIS in a few months, or maybe in September in Oxford in the conference of EAS. So hopefully we will have the opportunities, and there won't be any COVID restrictions, and we will see each other in person soon. And now I'm passing the voice to Joanna and Raphael.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Artur, I have to acknowledge Artur's great work in preparation of this seminar. He did like in the backstage. He did really a lot of. He made a lot of effort to make it real, and it seems to me clearly that it was worth. So Artur, many thanks. But also I wanted to thank our amazing, I would say already team. I hope this is a team of contributors to a special issue. So a message to you from now, which is not maybe in 100% precise, but this seminar, this workshop actually was aimed or was proposed to examine the options. It seems that we have a material to work with. So at the moment we would ask you, of course, Artur will probably send out an email with instructions and with advices and suggestions. how to operate later on, since we are now at the moment only 11, and at the beginning we were 18 until late evening, until late afternoon. But what we can say for sure is that if you are willing to contribute with your original paper and not published elsewhere before, and you are determined to work on it, please note us, send us an email by the end of this week, and then we will put together some guidelines where and how we should keep the consistency of. There are two options for us. We have been offered to edit a section in Israel Studies or Israel Studies Review, or the entire special issue. Everything depends to what extent we will be ready, and it's going to be possible to keep the consistency and somehow to make people, the individual paper coherent. But for sure, there is a common ground for not only a keyword public policies, but there is a larger common ground for further work. So what we definitely need is a note from you and information from you by the end of the week that you want to continue. And if you want to continue, we will immediately contact editors of these two journals, leading journals in Israel Studies. And within a month, we would be very happy to welcome your ready papers to be settled in one of the journal. But yes, if you may have any question or comments to what I said, please feel free to ask. If you have any ideas, of course, those are also more than welcome. And of course, Rafi, if there is anything, I mean, I'm sure that you would like to continue and add from your side.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you, Joanna, and Artur, and your team for organizing this. It is nice to see an idea translates into action and materializing, and now it has, and I hope it's going to be one out of many. I think that the experiment that we conducted proved until now successful, and I see bright future if the Russians will allow us to proceed. In terms of the going forward, I think that what we need to do is that Artur or you or both of you, I don't know what, but send a letter to all of us and set a date and deadline to see whether people are actually able to meet the deadline, and maybe also to check what kind of referencing is there, because later on this tedious thing can be an obstacle. So to make sure that we all are using the same referencing system when you submit a paper. I heard the majority of the papers, had some meetings in between that I could not attend the entire conference. From what I heard, I think there is a potential for a journal issue that surrounds about the entire workshop that we've done now. But of course, it depends how you translate these words into a full-fledged article. But I'll be more than happy to see it happening, and that we'll have a special issue. So I wish you all well, and I wish all of us peace and tranquility and return to sanity as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With these words, we are finishing our seminar. See you in future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.